Hi, Carlos. This is Ashley. I just wanted to check in and make sure you can hear us okay.
Oh, I was gonna say.
Yep, I hear you just fine. I hear you just fine, Ashley.
Hi, Carlos. Can you speak one more time?
Yep, I hear you just fine.
Thank you. I appreciate it. We're just waiting on Jim and Wendy to join us and Mr.
Okay.
Stratton to join us.
Okay. All right.
Sound keeps going off on Zoom.
Is that right?
Hi, Miss Miller. We are currently not in our board meeting yet. The mics are muted, so that's probably why you can't hear us.
Good morning, all. I believe we are ready to call this financial subcommittee meeting to order. Just some general housekeeping. We are grateful to have attendees here in person and also several online. For board members or speakers that are here in person, when you come up to speak, there are microphones directly in front of you. When they are red, the mic is not live. Please click on the mic when you want to talk. The mic will turn green and then you can speak and be heard. Once you are done speaking, please push the mic again so it turns red. For board members participating via Zoom, good to see you this morning. Please stay on mute. If you would like to speak, please push the hand icon to indicate that you have a question or would like to contribute. This will help us to know you would like to say something, and then we'll make sure you have an opportunity to speak. Participation during this meeting. The board would like this meeting to be a more informal discussion so that it can hear from all stakeholders while discussing each important agenda item. Therefore, members of the public are encouraged. Please participate throughout the meeting when the agenda items are being heard. For each agenda item, board staff will present the item, answer questions from board members, and then I will open the discussion up for stakeholders who wish to speak to the board on that agenda item. We will first ask if there is anyone in person that would like to speak, and once we are through those in person, we will transition and ask to those participating on Zoom. Prior to speaking, please remember to establish your name and where you represent to better inform the board. Ashley, would you like to do roll call?
Superintendent Designee Miller,
Here.
Mr. Ruiz,
I'm here.
Mr. Stratton. Mr. Stratton. Okay. Mr. Swanson,
Here.
you have a quorum.
Thank you, Ashley. Our first item is approval of meeting minutes from our last financial framework subcommittee on October 31st, our consent agenda.
I move to approve the consent agenda.
I second that motion.
Mr. Ruiz,
Yes.
Mr. Swanson,
Yes.
Mr. Stratton. Superintendent Designee Miller,
Yes.
motion passes.
During our last meeting of this subcommittee, we had several members interested in hearing more about the state's enrollment trends, Member Ruiz specifically. So we're excited today to welcome Jake Logan, the president of the Arizona Charter School Association, to do a presentation on that subject.
Rookie here. Madam Chair, thank you very much. As you noted, my name is Jake Logan. I'm the CEO of the Arizona Charter Schools Association. I really appreciate the invitation to be here, and I appreciate you all serving not only on the board, but also on the subcommittee. It's really important work. As you noted, Madam Chair, we've been doing some data and looking at enrollment trends and what may or may not be affecting those trends. So unfortunately for you guys, so the data is A+. Unfortunately for you guys, the speaker, me, is about B- on this issue. Kelly Powell, who's our data guy, is probably in the bottom of the Grand Canyon right now. So he was not able to be here today. So I'm pinch hitting for him with his data, but I think we can kind of walk through it. So we just have I'll be really brief, just a couple quick slides that hopefully speak to the board's desire to kind of see where everything is going. So if we can go to the next one. So this is probably the key slide, and ignore all the different numbers. And what I would, there we go. What I would recommend looking at is you see the bottom part year over year, where it says ADM and weighted ADM. I think those are the key numbers for this year. Keep a moment. This is a snapshot in time. These are the October numbers. They will change throughout the year. But I think this is probably your biggest barometer, at least for this year. And then we can compare that to how charters have grown historically. But if you see the ADM and charter school where it says 365.13, that means charter schools grew year over year statewide by 365 students as of right now. So while that is, and we'll see a slide in a second, historically lower than charter schools have grown, it is still growth. And in an environment, which we will see in about 2 slides, where there are just simply less kids in the system, I think it's a credit to you all as regulators and leaders on the board, but mainly to our schools, that they continue to offer attractive choices for parents, and that they continue to grow even in a declining enrollment situation. I think the other thing to note on this slide is below that, where it says district schools. So the district schools, according to kind of what Kelly put together, I've lost almost 17,000 students year over year, further illustrating that there just aren't as many kids enrolled in public K-12 as there were at one time. So again, my takeaway from this slide is slower growth than we've seen historically, but still a really good news story for charter schools, and that we are growing, albeit by a lot smaller amount. So if we go to the next slide, you guys. This slide illustrates the historic trends, and the light blue is the percentage of students in public K-12 that are enrolled in charter schools. So you can see from 2012 to 2023, it was a pretty big explosion of students. We went from 100 and let's call it almost 101,000 or 100,000, 83,000 students to a lot more, and it really grew. And you can see on the left, that's the comparison, the chart from 2012 from charter to district. So again, we had a really, really rapid expansion over a lot of years. Now that's started to slow down, as you can see in that kind of 2017, 2018, 2019 era. COVID was obviously a total once in a lifetime, hopefully, a statistical anomaly. So the numbers were a little funky from there. But you can see that historically, charter schools, we had a really, really good run starting in 2012. If we go to the next slide, and I think, Madam Chair, this is something that you were particularly interested in. So we look at birth counts and birth rates. It's just down. People are having less kids. And even though we're a migration state where people are moving to Arizona at a pretty good clip, there are just less kids. People are having smaller families or choosing not to have kids. And you can Google, I was talking to Ashley yesterday, I think it's the millennials, whichever one we're on, they just, they aren't having as many kids as they were historically through Arizona. If we go to the next slide. So this, I think, is really interesting. So the light blue line on the top is birth count, and the darker one is death count. So you can see that our birth count continues to go down. That spike in 2020, where the death count actually was higher than the birth count, was a COVID year. That was when things were tough, and hopefully again only once in a lifetime historical event. That's obviously leveled out since then, but you can really see starting in about 2010 that birth count going down. And for all of us in K-12, it starts in kindergarten and then it works all the way through the system. So I've heard others say that this senior graduating class this year may be the biggest we have in a while. If you go to the next slide, it's a little jumbled up there on the right, but this is ESA counts. So obviously we had ESAs in Arizona. I think some people are wondering, was that a factor in how that affects both district and charter school enrollment? We don't know. We don't have data on where the students that have gotten ESAs have came from. I think that's something that others are looking at. But you can see the explosion. So we obviously always had ESAs prior to 2022, but they were for specific subcategories, Native Americans, communities, special needs students. Then there was a pretty massive growth. And I'm sorry, it's jumbled up on the right, but I think it's about 67,000 students, give or take, enrolled in ESAs. And again, I don't have any more data than anybody else has on whether it was students that were already in private school or homeschooled, or students that were coming from districts, or students that were coming from charters. So I guess my narrative on the enrollment, and Madam Chair, I know Ashley had mentioned you all were interested in, birth counts going forward. I've seen some kind of speculation stuff, but we don't have any hard data. And I was hesitant to put a slide in a official meeting on that. I do think there's kind of Google types of things you can Google and check it out. But I haven't seen anything that suggests there's like a baby boom or something like that. So something for us all to be thoughtful for. But my overall narrative continues to be that charters continue to offer really great choices for students, albeit slower. We continue to grow. And that's a testament to our schools and to the folks that are doing the hard work out there every single day, not unlike yourself, Madam Chair. Last thing I'll just say before I'll shut up and answer any questions is I really appreciate the thoughtful nature of the subcommittee that you guys are going on. These are pretty tricky decisions. And I think John Schneider's testimony in the last meeting was really thoughtful about how you all are trying to calibrate. We don't ever want to see a school go be in a bad financial position, but also calibrating how that would impact the school and what the right sort of balance is as we move forward. So I appreciate the thoughtfulness of the committee. That's all I got.
Members, do we have any questions for Jake?
Mr. Logan, Madam Chair, Mr. Logan. Just a question, this is looking at call it the charter market share is going up, but the head count is basically at 2019 levels.
Yeah.
Right. What is the discussion in the charter community about? Is our market saturated? How should we be growing? Because I've been struggling with growth of adding new schools and saying they should just, if we're going to add schools, they got to be exceptional and like just crazy good. And what's the view of the charter world as you see, and what do you hear from that?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Member Swanson. So I think a couple things. One is obviously schools need to be smart about where they what kind of programming they're offering, where they're going. There are pockets in the state that I would argue are underserved by charter schools, and that I'd like to see more expansion in. I do think there's probably a general slowing of growth. You all in a couple months will consider new applications, which I don't want to say anything out of school. I don't know what it is, but it'll be less than it has historically been. So I think people are naturally responding to the market. But I do think, I think there is everyone's seeing the same numbers. And so I think people, these are business decisions too, over investing in capital and time and energy and money. So I think people are calibrating to the new system pretty well. High performers will always do great. And I'm with you. I think there are pockets where it's really, really exciting where charters could do great work. The other thing I'll just maybe note is we really advise our schools, and I know the board does as well, is to be thoughtful if you are looking at a financial situation. Your enrollment was down last year, to be fast, to be nimble, to be able to adjust accordingly. Sometimes schools aren't as nimble as we want, just like a business would be. If you're down 10%, you got to figure out where 10% savings are. And so we do a lot of training with our schools, and we continue to do that to encourage folks to be nimble if they are in that situation.
Jim, that's such a thoughtful question. And I know I've had conversations with Ashley, with Jake, with my friends in the charter community on a couple of different angles on that very question. So as authorizers, having this ADM measure and being thoughtful in how we view it if a school is declining is really important, because we contribute to the competition that may cause the ADM to decline, right? There's only so many students. And so if we move 2 or 3 schools into the neighborhood, or we authorize 2 or 3 schools into the neighborhood, it seems counterintuitive to have any negative repercussions on an ADM decline that would be expected or natural. I know that, and I don't know when and what year. It's just kind of one of those things I remember being talked about with all the people in my family and community that have been in charters. But there used to be like a 5-mile consideration. And I think that it may be time with the saturated market to re-elevate that conversation, so that we don't cannibalize each other and become, it's already a very competitive market. And then I also think that delicacy, going into the neighborhoods that are not served, that are seeking that representation, that need an alternative school to serve their students, prioritizing those neighborhoods would also improve our relationships with the public districts. If there's high performing public districts in the neighborhood and we open 2 or 3 charters in competition with them, we continue to foster that public versus charter conversation in a potentially unnecessary way. So I obviously support the free market with charters and, people having an opportunity, but I do think it's important to balance it with, are we accidentally having negative consequences for our own choices?
Well, and Madam Chairman, if I could just add to that,
Yeah.
I think a lot of it depends on what the schools look like and what they are. A school that's STEM, that is built for high performers, is going to be very different than a school that's trying to get kids that have dropped out of high school. And so some of that is physical proximity, as you noted. But it's also, what is their model? What are they trying to accomplish? What kind of students are they hoping to attract? So I know it's tricky. I'm with you. I think the free market generally has worked well, and these things sort themselves out generally. But I also understand Member Swanson's question about, again, calibrating appropriately.
Thank you. And just one other follow-up. Do you have any data on students that have left charters for ESAs?
We do, Madam Chair, Member Swanson, we do not have any data. My understanding is that part of the budget deal with Governor Hobbs and the legislature is trying to dig into some of that data. They had a hearing at the legislature, I don't know, a month or so ago, and they didn't have that data either. But I think people are very interested to see where these students, again, were they existing private school or homeschooled? Are they coming from charters? Are they coming from districts? Where are they coming from? And because that obviously makes you all smarter when you're making decisions. So I'm hopeful that we get some additional data on that, but I haven't seen it.
There's some murky waters too with the disappearing COVID students, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're living in strange times.
Mhm.
It's just a very you have a really interesting sort of the ingredients out there. Declining birth rates coming out of a pandemic, a once in a generation pandemic. There's just a lot of stuff going on. Yeah, working. Yeah. John said working from home, so it's a lot of. a lot of tricky stuff. It's not easy to run a school. They're amazing people that do it.
Do we have any other questions or comments for Jake?
Thanks, you guys. And thanks again for doing this.
Thank you, Jake. Hearing and seeing no questions or comments for Jake online, we will move to our next agenda item. This is a thick agenda. Item D, average daily membership measure, and we will start that discussion with a presentation by Andrea.
Subcommittee members, good morning. The Financial Framework's Average Daily Membership Measure, or ADM measure, considers the charter holder's student count or average daily membership over time. The ADM measure averages the annual percent change in the charter holder's ADM for the 3 most recent completed fiscal years, if available. The ADM measure classifies charter holders as small, medium, or large when assigning the rating. A charter holder's approaches standard or below standard rating on the ADM measure may be increased 1 rating category based on the charter holder's performance on the other 5 measures. This is referred to as the ADM measure's rating adjustment and will be considered under Agenda Item E. In September 2023, the Arizona Auditor General issued its performance audit and sunset review of the board. The sunset audit included 1 finding, which pertained to the board's financial framework. Among other things, the finding recommended the board modify its ADM measure to ensure it identifies substantial decreases in student enrollment and specifically mentioned the change in weighted student count measure used by the Auditor General in its school district financial risk analysis. In response to the Auditor General's concern, staff considered the school district measure, which uses 5 years of ADM, and the board's change in ADM, which is a calculation considered when assigning a probation risk level under the financial framework, and which uses 3 years of ADM. The probation risk level calculation considers the charter holder's change in ADM from year 3 to year 1, where year 1 is the audited fiscal year. So if one was calculating the change in ADM for the fiscal year 23 audit cycle, the calculation would use the charter holder's ADM for fiscal year 2021 and fiscal year 2023. Staff is proposing that the subcommittee recommend adding consideration of the audit year's growth rate and the charter holder's change in ADM to the ADM measure's current practice of averaging the 3 most recent growth rates. The meeting materials include a table that details staff's proposal, and a portion of that table is found on this slide. In this table, the threshold identified for the average calculation reflect the targets currently in place for the ADM measure. At today's meeting, the subcommittee may decide whether to recommend changing the items considered for the ADM measure, and if recommended, what modification, if any, should be made to staff's proposal. In addition, the subcommittee may direct staff to solicit public comment on the proposal, which the subcommittee would consider at its next meeting on December 1st. I'm available for questions.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Can you just spend a minute explaining maybe the differences between the primary, the larger scale context of difference between what we're doing and what's proposed here?
Yeah, so currently, when assigning a rating, we are only considering the average of those 3 growth rates. So what we are doing for the each audit cycle is we're looking at the last 4 years of ADM, and we are calculating the growth rate for each of those school years. And then we are averaging those together. And that average is what is used solely to determine where the charter holder falls in that calculation. And if you look at in approaches and below, it's very clear. It's number 1. In the meets standard, it's kind of a combination of the first part of number one and the first part of number two, but those average calculation amounts that are in this table are the amounts that we use to determine where a charter holder falls. So I get a meets if I'm a small school, and the average of those three growth rates is either shows an increase or shows a decrease of between 0 and negative 4.99%. I would get an approaches standard if that average shows a decrease of between 5% and 14.9%, 99%, and I would get a below standard if that calculation showed a decrease of 15% or more. Under this proposal, in addition to considering those average amounts, we're also proposing to consider the most recent, the audited year growth rate. So we've calculated those three growth rates. We've averaged them together. Now we're going to give a little weight to that most recent growth rate. And if that shows a decline, and in this proposal, the thresholds are the same as they are for the average. I don't know if that's appropriate, but that's what was developed for this proposal. So that would factor in as well. And then finally, we're looking at, we're proposing looking at including that change in ADM from year one or year 3 to year 1. And these we have set kind of higher thresholds for. We're really looking for things that may really warrant the board's being aware of. So those thresholds are if you're positive or you don't have a change that is, if your change is, I think of the appropriate word, between 0 and negative 24.99%, then you're still a meets. If your change is between negative 25% and just under negative 50%, that would be an approaches. And if your change is greater than negative 50%, that would be a below. Now, again, in the next agenda item, we'll be discussing the rating adjustment. So this discussion right here does not factor in the rating adjustment at this point in time. So this would be that initial, where are you placed prior to considering a rating adjustment?
Thank you so much for that clarification. Questions, comments?
Andrea? Clear as mud.
I figured as much. As I was saying it, I figured as much.
I have a couple questions. So on this table 2 or the proposal, and just I'm looking at this and trying to think logically, small and medium are exactly the same and large is different. Now, and larger schools have a smaller tolerance to fall out of, to get a lower rating, right? But aren't larger schools better equipped to handle a larger shift, because they've got a bigger budget, they've got probably many more years of experience. I'm just wondering, and I'm sure you have a perfectly good explanation for this, that why, and or to simplify, would it be appropriate just to have the same going all the way across?
My perfectly good explanation is that this is kind of what developed out of the last time we did this. I think that was kind of the consensus, but I think it is definitely, this is the time to look at what we did in the past and to see if it still has merit, or if there would be benefit to either changing them or aligning, if there really doesn't need to be a distinction, and aligning all of them.
So let's say a medium school, 200, a 5% decline is 190, right? And a large school of 600, a 3% decline is 588. And let's say we took that to 5%, right? That'd be 570. That's a pretty small, it just seems like maybe that they would be a larger school would be more able to handle a drop from 600 to 570 than a 200 school from 200 to 190. So I don't know why we have the smaller tolerance. And I'm not picking on you.
No, not at all. I don't, on the surface, I don't have any concern with that. I do know that, again, at the time, the initial proposal was developed, there were, recommendations, by the Reason Foundation that were considered. And I do believe at that point in time that what the Auditor General's office was doing in terms of targets, not so much calculations and all of that, but in terms of establishing different thresholds for different size schools was something that was pulled in from what the Auditor General's office was doing with school districts. But again, if it doesn't, if it doesn't seem to like really warrant all of this, it's much easier to put something out that just says, here's the same thing for everybody. I mean, it gets rid of that, like, here's your threshold, here's your threshold. It just kind of makes it consistent across the board. So I think if that's where you're leaning, or thinking
Just
about, or asking about, or whatever,
love to hear
that
from
is
an
fine.
But I'll also just follow up. So then we do a simple average, kind of a rolling average of the 3 years, if you have 3 years of data? And are we gonna later in the next section talk about how we weight the first year more or something? Or the most recent year?
At this point in time, or at least in this proposal, there is no weighting involved. It is, I think it comes down to, does the subcommittee feel, whatever the kind of the cut points are and whether the sizes stay, does this subcommittee feel that 3-year average, if you have all of that data, is sufficient and provides the information that they need to know where their schools are? Or does the subcommittee feel that, as recommended in the Auditor General's report, that those averages, you lose things in? So if someone had a big decline, that could be lost in the averaging that we do. But is it important? And that's kind of, I think, one of the underlying questions is there value? Does the board or subcommittee see value in knowing or identifying or considering those declines, whether that be what happened in the most recent year, whether that be using the probation risk level calculation, what happened from year 3 to year 1, whether it's using something else, whether it's using none of those things? Does the board see value in having the measure capture that? And again, this is a discussion. So if you guys are comfortable with the averages, that's okay. If you guys want to have have substantial decreases, however that's defined and however that's calculated, considered, this is the opportunity to do that. But again, that end result or end decision is yours based on what you feel you need, what the framework should capture, and what you feel you need in this process. And that may be what we have, and maybe something else.
And Madam Chair, if I may just add to that, just to maybe clarify a little bit, and to Member Swanson's question, all three, like number 1, number 2, number 3, right? All 3 of the scenarios under the below standard and approaches, and then kind of combined under 1 and 2 under the meet standard, they all have the same weight, because what board staff was trying to do to address the concerns raised in the audit is to ensure that we are identifying different scenarios which may be of concern as it pertains to enrollment or declining of enrollment. Because to Andrea's point, when looking at the averages over a 3-year or 4-year span, and with those 3 growth rates, there were times where we were not capturing a dramatic decline. in year one and from year 1 to year 3. And so we try to take this from like a holistic perspective of like where do we need to capture, or where would it be beneficial potentially, again, to board's discretion, those declines.
See that member Wes has a question. Are you satisfied for the time being?
Yeah, no. Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just, so there's in the data or in the information, there was a chart called portfolio overview that I actually had a conversation with Andrea about to kind of understand, what the implications of it. And I think that kind of visually, I was struggling with this table just to see, well, how does this impact? And so, I don't know, are you able to show that portfolio overview graphic? It's on page 4. It's on page 4 of the information. It just shows, I guess it visually shows, of the charter portfolio, how the current ADM, everybody's like 90% are meeting, but then when you start tweaking things, it kind of starts to skew those that meet and those that approach and those that are below, and so it shows that maybe, but then I also we were talking about, you had COVID, COVID's mixed in there, so that's going to throw things around too. So it's kind of, maybe the current doesn't quite capture, but then the changing with the adjustments maybe maybe overemphasize or overcorrects a little bit, and you start seeing more people that fewer people that are meeting and more people that are approaching, and that could, but then I don't know if that's skewed because of stuff that was happening with COVID. So I think the current, I guess my comment is, the current doesn't seem to show changes, but then what's being proposed may that's the one, the changes that are proposed may overemphasize what's happening and what's happened, because we're just looking at what happened historically, and there was kind of this one-time event that skews the data to make it look not so well. But then, given the information that we have from Jake on the slowing growth, I think we have to find something, some sort of compromise that picks this up, and I don't know what the answer is, but there's got to be something in between, I think, here. And then I think also we went when we go into the next item, there's if somebody makes an adjustment and recognizes these changes in ADM and makes adjustments, then and is reducing expenses, then this is the financial framework where if they're making those adjustments, a decrease in ADM shouldn't necessarily be penalizing.
To piggyback, member Rose, on those comments and questions. So this portfolio projection and comparison, is this just what they would have done on that measure, or does this take into consideration the fact that if all of their other measures met, they would fall off? Does that question make sense?
It does. And so in this graph, the blue information reflects actual performance with rating adjustments. So If they were below, but that got bumped up to an approaches, that's how it's going to be reflected on here. The remaining 3 options do not address the rating adjustment. So the orange option is just taking the blue information and eliminating the rating adjustments. And then the other 2 options are calculated based on no rating adjustments being incorporated. So when you're comparing information, when you compare the gray or the gold, you'd be really comparing it to the orange to see what the impact is. But no, when you're looking at this graph, I guess I shouldn't say no, but depending upon the outcome of the next agenda item, it is possible that the rating adjustments would occur, and some of this performance that you're seeing in the gray and gold options would be higher than what's on the graph, or lower, I guess, as the case may be.
Madam Chair, I guess in Member Ruiz, that was a really good point you made, and so what's going to help staff? Which one of these options can help staff better do their job to monitor schools and make sure that they're not going to be in a spot where we have to take action? Because if you go to the proposal, for example, you go and if you look at if you look on page 7 with the, I meant on page 6 with the small schools, you're going to have the biggest impact. You're going to have 30% of the small schools go from meets down to 54%. Or something like that.
Yeah, I would point out that is without the rating adjustment, but there will be a decline.
Yeah. And
Any
so that
way you
just
look
more-
at
so
it,
that-
there will
that
be a
adds
decline.
Things on your plate. And are those things on your plate helping you do your job? I'm having like different thoughts in my head. And it's like, which one should I go with? Did you have something you wanted to say? Okay.
So I think one of the the intents of this financial framework, and we heard from at the Charter Association conference last week about from S&P about the transparency of this framework, right? And how helpful it is to be accurate and transparent about what is truly happening. And so I think from that perspective, having the multiple ways in which we're looking at ADM and making sure that we're seeing the trends accurately is going to be the most helpful to board staff and to the public. But with regard to the board's work, we do believe that it's important to have that adjustment.
Thank you.
Did we receive advanced public comment on this? Do we have any already established public comment?
We did not, but this was only released on Monday. Monday, so I don't know that there was time for people to really kind of digest it and then to comment. But no, we did not receive any comment on this.
Do we have any comments or questions from our attendees? Yeah, Lynn, come on up, please. Remember to tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Lynn Adams, and I guess I'm here on behalf of myself and maybe the portfolio of schools, some of the schools that I represent. For this measure, I sort of want to key off the Member Swanson and Member Ruiz's comments, which are, I think it's really important to think about why this data is important. What are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to solve? It's one thing just to collect the data, but what is it that you're trying to do with this data? And I think that's where the comments were going, and with the next agenda item too. It's great to have this data and to know if schools are going up or down, but going up or down is inherently not a bad thing. If you lose enrollment, there may be a number of reasons why. And if you adjust expenses, then that may be an okay thing. Or maybe it's an okay thing for a school to go down. Maybe they intentionally want to reduce, either to provide different services to their students, to drill into a certain kind of curriculum. Again, there are a number of reasons, and I don't think an inherent increase or decrease is necessarily a bad or a good thing. So I think it's just, again, important when you're thinking about these things. What are you trying to accomplish? And what are you actually accomplishing with this data? Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Yeah, John, please.
Thank you. I have three thoughts on this, and then probably have more as I talk out loud, because that's the way my brain works. That I'd like to share. Again, these are, it's my opinion, but I spent a lot of years looking at charter schools from a credit perspective. First of all, with respect to the comments of Member Swanson on size, I agree wholeheartedly that a large school is much better able to withstand same percentage changes as a smaller school because of the economies of scale. We see that all the time. So I'm not sure why they should be treated differently. I'm sure there's cases where that, where there's a break point for a large school versus a little one, but I'm not sure why they should be treated differently because there are economies of scale in a larger organization. Secondly, I'm not a big fan, and wasn't, I think, when we did this 5 years ago, of the averages of averages. I think that the pattern of change, a pattern and scale of change using that, a negative, a large negative, a small negative, a big positive, they could hide what's really going on in terms of trend. They don't really very well. It's an easier way to try to look at trend, but it's not very mindful of more recent results. I'd be much, in my mind, just gut wise, without seeing how the statistics might play out, more in favor of some sort of weighted average where you get more credit for growth or change in students. There's a heavier weight for more recent years and a lighter rate for for older years. I don't know if it would change a lot, but I think it'd probably be in certain cases, it would probably be better suited for identifying or not identifying a school going in the wrong direction or right direction. And then lastly, I don't think you can, in my mind, you can't take this measure on its own. The next one has to be part of it, because schools are out there to run, to meet the provisions under their charter contract, to be quality educational institutions and to run them solvently, not to gen students up to meet a metric. And we had a school here last week who talked about a mindful reduction in class size, and as long as they're planning for it and appropriately run all their other measures, there's nothing wrong with being smaller. But this would, potentially, without that rating adjustment, put people into a classification of not meeting, simply because they made strategic changes, or even if they happened without strategic intent, that they reacted properly to them. So I in my mind, you cannot separate the two, or else you are going to increase staff's burden trying to winnow through schools that are actually pretty good schools, but are not meeting metrics by the letter of the metric. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's difficult for me conceptually to consider this, as you said, in absence of the next, and frankly, in absence of a much later agenda item where we talk about other measures being considered for multiple years. So if we're comparing, I know it's a rated adjustment and we look at how they were on the other measures, but if the other measures are just the past year in a snapshot and there's no trend for giving schools time maybe to respond to a decline, then I do think this could be unintentionally punitive at a time when we just heard great feedback about how in general we should be expecting ADM to decline. I do think at least what I think I've heard as the why that we're looking at this was both board staff and auditor general wanting to more accurately capture a school that is declining so significantly that they need assistance. So to me, that's not always the same as what we project publicly, for our schools on their dashboard. So I don't know. Do we have any other comments or public input from anyone attending online or in person? Yeah, come on up, Jake.
Don't want to beat a dead horse, but I thought John's comments were right on, and I understand, Member Swanson, why you're kind of thinking this thing out the way you are. But I thought John's comments were pretty spot on. So, for what it's worth.
Madam Chair, I just want to, what he said is right. And when we're giving bondholder numbers, we're giving just the flat enrollment numbers that they have. And this isn't just a black and white dashboard picture for us. Like the charter holder last week said, the school that it could play into it. So I wish there was some type of a narrative or appeal process on this black and white so that we can explain. There used to be back in the day when we had to explain why our numbers changed or why we had a loss. So it would be nice not to have a black and white, here's your spreadsheet and this is what it shows, to kind of explain why we did the things we did, why the numbers went down, why we had a loss in income, those types of things, so that that it was calculated.
Thank you. Just for clarity, and I apologize if it's repetitive or should be obvious, but none of the proposals for ADM currently are suggesting that we get rid of the rating adjustment, right? None of them are saying that schools would not, that this would not be considered in context for other measures, or that, go ahead.
That is correct. Staff is not proposing that at all.
Madam Chair, it seems like this action is being taken to address the Auditor General and the sunset report. I just don't know if we're adding any value to what we already do that won't already come out in the financial metrics. And other qualitative things that we're doing to assess schools' performance. We can add this, it's just gonna add more work to your plate. And I'm not, I don't know if this is a solution trying to find a problem. Is that what you said? But I'm not, because I think Superintendent Designee Miller is correct in that, some of the other metrics are going to be important, equally important as this. And then, why is this, the narrative of why is school shrinking is can be a million different reasons. And then to Mr. Snyder's point of the averages of averages. So I don't know. I think maybe we continue this topic and maybe we'll learn something more as we go through more agenda items. Are we allowed to just table this? Would you like to just table it?
Yeah.
Or is there value in asking for public comment? And let me ask a really crazy question. Second part. Can we ask the Auditor General to come talk to us?
Chair. Madam Chair and Member Swanson, absolutely. If you think it'd be beneficial to have the Auditor General's office come and present, we can ask. I don't know if they'd be willing to come and present.
Or maybe, could this subcommittee and some staff request a meeting with the Auditor General?
Staff can take the meeting with the Auditor General's office and maybe one or two members from the subcommittee, but we would need to have it.
Because that'd be a poll.
Yeah, we would need to be consistent with open meeting law.
Sure.
With that stated, though, I think would it be helpful to table this for a moment and move on to the adjustment conversation and see if that gives some clarity to this conversation? And it might not, I don't know. But that might just give us a little bit a better idea how you want to move forward. And then
Does it require a motion?
Yeah.
Okay, I move to table agenda item D and maybe take it back up later in the meeting.
I second that motion.
Do you want to specify when you want to pick that back up, or?
If needed.
It would be,
You can take it at the end, or?
as a suggestion,
after agenda.
to clarify, you want it after item J,
Yes.
or would you potentially want it after item L, debt principal, like to get, or,
Let's just take it up after.
okay.
Yeah.
You'd like to make your motion and indicate that you're going to be taking it after.
I moved to table agenda item D. I'm being reconsider it after agenda item L.
I second that motion.
Member Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Stratton, Mr. Swanson,
Aye.
Superintendent Designee Miller,
Aye.
motion passes.
As we move on to agenda item E, also correlated back to the Auditor General's report, for the entire time that I've been in this industry, I've watched an ebb and flow of Auditor General just being one, but a primary lead in trying to put apples to oranges. Like, charter schools are not measured, or their performance is not accurately reflected using the same metrics that school districts can be measured by. Just two different square peg circles. So I appreciate the subcommittee's understanding of that and detail-oriented perspective to make sure we make the right decisions, both for the board and for our schools. So moving on to ADM measure rating adjustment. I believe we have a presentation again by Andrea to get started on this.
Yes, subcommittee members. As mentioned with the previous agenda item, the Financial Framework's average daily membership measure, or ADM measure, considers the charter holder's student count or average daily membership over time. Unlike the Financial Framework's other measures, the ADM measure provides for a rating adjustment if certain conditions are met. Those conditions are identified on this slide. The ADM measure rating adjustment was included in the Financial Framework because the board cannot take action, legal or other administrative action, against a charter due solely to low or declining enrollment, where all other measures indicate the charter holder is financially viable based on the most recent audited financial statements. The Financial Framework is intended to identify charter holders with financial concerns and ramps up the consequences for those that do not demonstrate improvement. The data show that small charter holders or those serving fewer than 200 ADM have benefited the most from the adjustment. The adjustment's use increased significantly in the pandemic years. While a charter holder is eligible for the adjustment if one of the framework's other 5 measures is rated approaches standard, the data show that that situation applied to only 10% of the 207 charter holders that received an adjustment from approaches to meets over the last 4 audit cycles, and only 5% of the 40 charter holders that received an adjustment from below to approaches. In September 2023, the Auditor General issued its performance audit and sunset review of the board. The sunset audit included one finding which pertained to the board's financial framework. In the finding, the Auditor General identified concerns it had with the ADM measures rating adjustment. According to the sunset audit, and I quote, "The board's method of incorporating its ADM measure rating into its financial framework limits its ability to identify charter holders' financial difficulties that are linked to low or declining student enrollment. Specifically, if a charter holder has 0 below standards or only 1 approaches standard rating for its other 5 measures, the board's financial framework requires that the board adjust the ADM measure rating to the next highest measure rating, essentially negating any financial difficulties that would have been identified using the ADM measure as an independent assessment." In addition to identifying substantial decreases in enrollment, which was discussed under the previous agenda item, the finding recommended the board understand the reasons for declining or low enrollment, assess the severity, and determine and take an appropriate course of action. In response to this recommendation, staff is developing an internal policy to review enrollment for all charter schools throughout the year for declining enrollment to better understand the charter holder's financial situation given the reduction in revenue. The hope is that staff can work when needed with these charters throughout the year as opposed to waiting until the following audit is released. Prior to the subcommittee being formed, the board received written feedback about the ADM measure currently not including any adjustments specific to the pandemic's effect on enrollment at virtual schools and on dropout numbers. Additionally, at its October 31st meeting, the subcommittee received verbal comment from a charter representative concerned that her plans to temporarily reduce her school's ADM to assist with onboarding teachers could result in the school being identified for financial intervention. At today's meeting, the subcommittee may decide whether to recommend changes to the ADM measures rating adjustment and may direct staff to solicit public comment on the proposal, which the subcommittee would consider at its next meeting. I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Andrea. Do we have any immediate questions? Based on a lot of the feedback that we've received here and just in practice, I feel like with COVID, with all of the considerations, that it makes sense to make the rating adjustment to a meets standard if all other measures are met. That would be, I feel like that would be the most fair way to apply this adjustment, but I would really like to hear questions or feedback from other board members or operators or anyone with interest. Please go ahead.
Madam Chair. Andrea, is staff recommending that instead of the current 1 measure rating category increase, determine if the ADM measure rating adjustment should just be moved to meet standard in all situations?
Staff would be okay with that. That was identified as one of the board action, or excuse me, the subcommittee action items here. But yes, staff would, that change would kind of meet, I think, the intent of the adjustment and kind of support that if they're showing strong performance in the other areas, then maybe it should just go to meets rather than just 1 up, which could be below 2 approaches.
And just for my own education on this, what we're saying is that if we have an ADM issue that comes up in our annual review but the school is otherwise financially performing, operationally performing, academically performing, they have their fingerprint cards, all that stuff, right? That they will, that we give them sort of just a little bit of a pass and say, okay, you got everything under control. We're okay.
That would be true, except in this consideration, we're not going to be looking at their academic performance or
Okay.
operational performance, but that is true
Okay.
with
for the other
everything
things.
else.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Member Ruiz, it looked like you might have a question.
No, I'm back. My I don't know what happened. I touched something and everything went blank and I had to restart. So I'm back.
Welcome back. Do you need us to recap any of this summary, or are you good?
No, I'm good.
Any other comments on this agenda item? For clarity's sake, if we were to take action on this agenda item, it would be for our current system, potentially. And then when we cycle back to the other agenda item, then it would apply to any updated ADM measure.
I think that would be correct unless you want to have the adjustment be to meets in all situations. And that would be something that we would have to kind of add or adjust in or incorporate in your motion, because that would be different than the current practice of just bumping it up one category. It would be to bump them to meet. So that would be something that would need to be mentioned, I guess.
Do you feel comfortable with that?
To you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm going to make a motion. Based upon the review of the meeting materials and the subcommittee's deliberations, I move that the subcommittee recommend that we change from the current practice of one rating category increase to a movement to meet standards in all situations under the circumstances that would cause a rating adjustment. I further direct board staff to solicit preliminary public comment on the proposed changes discussed today for a period of not less than 5 business days and report the results of the public comment to the subcommittee at its December 1st, 2023 meeting.
Madam Chair and Member Swanson, may I clarify that motion, please? Mr. Swanson, you had mentioned that the rating adjustment would take effect if the charter would meet the standards in situations where an adjustment would be appropriate. Just to clarify, does that mean that if a charter receives an approaches or below standard under the ADM measure, but all the other measures are rated meets or one is rated approaches, that it be adjusted all the way to a meet standard?
I believe so. Yes.
Thank you.
I second that motion.
Mr. Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Swanson,
Aye.
Superintendent Designee Miller. Motion passes.
Thank you. Okay, we going to take a step away from ADM. Agenda item F is unrestricted days liquidity targets. And we will start this agenda item with a presentation by Andrea.
Subcommittee members, currently the threshold for a meet standard on the unrestricted days liquidity measure is 30 or more days liquidity. Charter holders with fewer than 15 days receive a below standard rating. At the subcommittee's October 31st meeting, staff presented a proposal to increase over time the meet standard threshold from 30 days to 90 days. Based on discussions that occurred at the October meeting and direction provided by the subcommittee, staff has prepared a revised proposal. The meeting materials include a table that details the revised proposal, and this table has also been included on the next slide for today's meeting. Under the revised proposal, the meet standard target would increase to 45 days for the fiscal year 2025 audits and to 60 days for the fiscal year 2027 audits. As noted in the table, the proposal includes two ways for a charter holder to receive a meet standard rating. For example, charter holders would receive a meets in fiscal year 2025 if they have at least 30 but less than 45 days liquidity and their number of days increased from fiscal year 2024 to fiscal year 2025. Under the revised proposal, the below standard target would increase from 23 days for the fiscal year 2025 audits to 30 days for the fiscal year 2026 audits. Pursuant to policy and procedures approved by the board in October, the board will annually review the financial framework, any feedback provided, and the portfolio's performance. If it appears the timeline for implementation may need to be changed, staff will present this information to the board. Additionally, following the review of the fiscal year 2025 audits, which the board will receive in fiscal year 2026, the proposed increase to 60 days will be placed on a board agenda so the board may reevaluate based on more recent portfolio performance data. At today's meeting, the subcommittee may decide what further changes, if any, should be made to the revised proposal and may direct staff to solicit public comment on the proposal, which the committee would consider at its next meeting. I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm assuming we didn't get any official public comment on this agenda item.
We did not receive anything on the new proposal. Again, I think it was probably a timing issue.
Do we have anyone here or online who would like to speak to this revised proposal? Member Swanson.
Superintendent Designee Miller. I'll go with Wendy in a second. So the plan is to get to move to 90. So
to clarify, Member Swanson, the recommendation or what is included in the board materials is to ultimately get to 60 days liquidity for a meet standard or 45 days when a charter is increasing those days liquidity. And that would be through FY 2027 audits. Originally, there was a, at the last subcommittee, it was 90 days. And then based on the stakeholder feedback, this is what was updated.
Okay, will there be is this the plan for now forever, or is there a plan to get, are we picking one of the three columns?
Member Swanson, to clarify, no, this would be the full decision. It's a ramp up, right? It's a phased in approach. So if you look down at implementation, you see that
I got it.
Yep. So the first.
Thank you. That's why I was confused.
Okay.
Got it.
I think one of the reasons, I'm sorry, were you gonna say something else, Ms. Frick? One of the reasons that this is being reproposed as a roll into 60 was just the percentage of schools that were identified that would fall into below standard quickly based on the other established measure, doubling the measure.
Well, if I may, I think this is good stewardship of taxpayer dollars, and it is, what I consistently say is running charters are difficult. It's not just about teaching, it's about the operations and the finance side of it. And I think this is makes good sense.
Do we have, would Jake, would you like to make some comments? Yeah.
Chair and members, thanks for, and thank you to staff for, I know a lot of stakeholder input, and this was a big area of discussion in the last meeting. My one just request, and I appreciate, I think we're going in the right direction here. My one, I guess ask would be, is I don't know that this has been circulated widely, no one's fault or anything within the field. And so before you all take any kind of formal action, maybe give us a little bit of chance just to kind of test that. And I know you all have kind of looked at how this would affect different kind of schools, but more anecdotal kind of would help me a little bit. But I'm grateful for the consideration and the thoughtfulness of the approach, but I don't know if you're locked into taking an action on this today, or if that's something that maybe we can let the field kind of think through a little bit more and how that'll affect different schools. I also appreciate the tiered approach. So it's not just on this day, boom, but it's kind of a ramp up as you all get to, where you want to be. So that's my 2 cents on this one.
Great. Good comment. I'd like to make a motion. Based upon a review of the meeting materials and the subcommittee's deliberations, I move that the subcommittee continue its discussion and consideration of agenda item F to the December 1st, 2023 meeting of the subcommittee, and that the subcommittee take no action at this time. I further direct board staff to solicit preliminary public comment on the proposed changes discussed today for a period of not less than 5 business days, and report the results of the public comment to the subcommittee at its December 1st, 2023 meeting.
I second that.
Member Ruiz?
Do we, now that we have a motion can we have a little bit of discussion? Can I do a little bit of discussion? Or we're just voting on the motion?
If you have more deliberation or discussion on this item, we need to do that prior to making the motion and voting on the motion.
So Member Reyes, I suppose you could vote no if you'd like to have discussion.
No.
Draw motion.
I'm sorry. Could the motion be repeated?
Absolutely. Based upon a review of the meeting materials and the subcommittee's deliberations, I move that the subcommittee continue its discussions and consideration of agenda item F to the December 1st meeting. 2023 meeting.
I vote aye. Okay. I vote aye.
Member Swanson?
I'm with Mr. Ruiz.
Okay. Superintendent Designee Miller?
Not to sound like a broken record, but I feel like it's very hard to consider this agenda item before others. And I encourage every person who has logged in and every person that's come in person to please spread the word, because this agenda item desperately needs a stakeholder feedback. And I vote aye.
Motion passes.
We will move on to agenda item G, factors affecting days liquidity, with a presentation by Andrea.
This is the first of 4 brainstorming items staff has placed on today's agenda. These discussions will provide staff with a better idea of how to proceed and what to prepare for the subcommittee's December meeting. Now to agenda item G. The financial framework's current unrestricted days liquidity measure focuses on how many days liquidity the charter has, but doesn't consider how the charter holder derived that liquidity. Charter holders may access credit lines, transfer funds between related schools or entities, or obtain advances from an outside party on their state equalization payments. The latter is referred to as factoring. Unlike cash generated from the charter holder's operations, amounts obtained from credit lines, fund transfers, or factoring will have to be repaid at some point in the future. The fact that these funds must be repaid is currently not addressed under the financial framework. For this agenda item, staff is wanting to know whether use of credit lines, fund transfers between related parties, and/or factoring should be taken into account under the financial framework, and if they should be considered, how that might be accomplished. This slide includes possible questions for that the subcommittee may use, but does not have to use to guide this discussion. I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Andrea. My internet has, I think, taken another, oh, here, I'll get it up here. Any immediate member questions for Andrea on this item? Member Ruiz?
Yeah, yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I think, I can't remember if it was, it was at the Charter Association conference, or maybe it was the last meeting, that we're talking about, you know, how the bondholder, who the bond issuers are, you know, they're looking at certain things, and you know, I think factoring once you get hooked on that, it's you're in trouble. I mean, from just I've known people that have not chartered, but just, you know, machine shops, and what they get into factoring, and they never get off of it, and it's so I just think something like this needs to be, because all of a sudden the way people are using short-term money, and this it definitely is gonna affect their financing going forward, and so we've got it, something, this kind of thing where money is being used for liquidity, but then does have to get paid back. Yeah, we've got to look at that. It's almost if you're taking this, the whatever interest rates you're paying, you're in bad shape once you get to this point.
Thank you, Member Ruiz. And it's really important to me that the framework doesn't encourage schools to make irresponsible decisions that are not in their best interest in order to meet the framework, because this is such a public measure of our performance. You know, potential interest rates are determined by, so as soon as you start to trend in the orange or the yellow and the red on the dashboard, you start to have other consequences. So I do think right now it is so high stakes that schools feel a pressure to make decisions to meet the metric. So I'm not sure that the answer is, you know, trying to catch them and not in the metric, in so much as perhaps like a balance, sort of like we're doing on the ADM, where, you know, if one metric is approaching 1 year, has gone yellow or red, perhaps it could be weighted if all the others are green before they enter into intervention, or before they have a public mark. Maybe there could be an internal measure where there's an intervention taken prior to, and I know that the board staff is not intending to ever be punitive with this. That's just sometimes how it feels in the field because of the impacts we have. So I agree with you. This is a slippery slope and really dangerous. And I wonder if some of the other considerations, creating multi-year trends in these, so we're watching as they're going up and down versus just that one snapshot, because this would be easier to pull out in a multi-year metric, right? They're not going to move the money each year in the same way. So we could watch those trends go up and down. Or if we want to create a situation where not just one metric can throw the school into intervention, those would be two ways I feel like might impact what we're trying to catch here, or to shed light on or help schools with. Other thoughts?
Wendy, I don't know if staff or Jake has any, how extensive is the use of factoring in charters?
In recent years, it has declined, but in the earlier years, it may have been around 10% is probably a little high, 5 to 10% of the portfolio doing it, but I'll defer to, there might be others in the room who has a little more knowledge on that.
I agree with Mr. Ruiz that is if people are factoring to make days liquidity, that's a bad reason to do it. And that if this is just a thought-provoking item, that we should be maybe thinking about in the future, saying that, well, days liquidity are X, but you have access to a line of credit that is in force and valid, that, you know, you could draw on. But I think forcing a school to go out and raise cash from a hard money sort of lender, if you will, is not a great thing for us to make them do to meet a target if they could otherwise, so either looking at potentially looking at receivables from the state or other resources or available lines of credit. I don't know if our committee helpers have any comments on that.
First, thank you, Member Swanson. I don't know how many schools used factoring. Those who we didn't see them come to us and ask to borrow long-term money because clearly they weren't in a position to do so. And I think it is in my personal opinion, it is, it's a red flag, and shouldn't be. Well, all of the things that are listed here, credit lines, fund transfers from related entities, and factoring, all to me are accounting tricks, that hide the current operations capabilities of the school, which is what this liquidity measure is there, I think, to do. So I think that this is a very reasonable proposal. There are other ways that in the financial markets people go about getting to this, and it includes, it would allow someone to use a credit line, but it would also take into account that current liability as well. There's a current ratio, which is current assets divided by current liabilities, and you have to come up with whatever appropriate ratio that is for charter schools. But it would then, it sort of negates out that obligation that you undertake by drawing on it. To me, I don't know if we need to go there. I think it works to just exclude those sorts of draws that with them come some obligation to repay, which isn't really creating real liquidity.
Madam Chair, may I ask for clarification on that?
Of course.
John, can you further clarify where those three options, the credit lines, the fund transfers, factoring, where that would not be included? You said to not have it be included. Where would that not be included? Or what measure?
Well, my understanding is currently the use of a credit line or a transfer from a related party or factoring would result in cash sitting on your balance sheet on June 30th that would be counted in that numerator of your calculation. And the proposal, which I agree with, would say that to the extent you have any of those liabilities related to that, or the source of capital was from any of those, or the cash was from any of those things, that they would be excluded from that numerator. You very well may have to repay that credit line on July 2nd. Or return that money to your related party the day after the end of the fiscal year. And that's not, that's smoke and mirrors in my mind, Does that answer your question, Ashley?
Yes, thank you.
Do you have anyone else that has feedback on this or direction? I think we're not looking to entertain a motion. We're just looking for maybe items to flush out for the next meeting. Is that?
Yeah, we're looking at what the committee would like the staff to kind of work through so that we can bring something back. It sounds like we're proceeding down this path so that we can bring something back. If the decision is not to, then we would not bring anything back.
I would like staff to, continue work on ferreting out I'll call it the smoke and mirrors, and how can we improve that measure, and stop creating situations where we put schools in a bad position because we're got a snapshot in time.
Is there a reason on this one that you've, I mean, I really appreciate the clarity. You've specifically noted that average daily membership you would, see in isolation as it pertained back to this measure. I mean, is that necessary or could we set that one aside? For instance, it mentions like this proposed meet standard charter holder did not receive advances on its state equalization payment during the audited fiscal year, or charter holder did not receive advances on its state equalization payments, and all other measures received meet standard. Please note that the ADM would have to meet standard. I would prefer to set ADM aside on this one. I feel like that's been the sentiment we've received from stakeholders.
Yeah, the reason I had done that is because with the factoring, that is paid back there. The group that has entered into that agreement is going to collect it from their payments. And so if they're having declining enrollment, before we make an adjustment, again, let's say we did this measure as it is, and the school was factoring their ADM measure if they were eligible for an adjustment, which I don't know how that would play in with the factoring, but if they were eligible on their own for an adjustment, they would get that.
Okay.
But the average daily membership, because that is kind of the driving force, and that's where that group is pulling it from. That's why I did that. But
Okay.
we could also not consider. I mean, I think it could go either way.
Okay. Yeah, maybe we can continue that conversation. Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel. We have Eric Vogue online that would like to make a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify on one item. So with the line of credit, so we have one investment product that we have through an insurance contract where we're investing money that way, but we could always pull money back out of it through a line of credit, or we could just pull the money out. We haven't used it ever in our for our companies, but that's available. I just want to make sure when we're talking about line of credit, we're talking about, the liquidity with where you've borrowed money to increase your cash to meet a standard, as opposed to where you have available liquidity that wouldn't, through a line of credit that's secured fully by what you've already invested in cash into a product. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I think so. Thank you very much for that comment, Eric. Do we have any other comments online that we've missed? Kevin?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully I'm not too loud. I agree totally with everything that was said, especially factoring if you're going down that road. The one, point I wanted to make, if you don't want to encourage that, I think they talked at last meeting about allowing, the grants receivable to be in the numerator if they're, came in, in July for expenses that they're already incurred during the audit period. I think that would be a good add, while you exclude the line of credit and the factoring and the other items. So they could kind of work hand in hand with each other, I think.
Thank you, Kevin. Any other considerations in order to revisit this on our next agenda? I feel like this might be more applicable to a future item, but I just know that we've received comment from someone that couldn't be here today to, how does our equity factor into our liquidity, and is that being considered? Currently, it really isn't. And there are times where it would be appropriate for it to be considered. Okay, if there are no other comment, yes, please, John.
Well, for raising other concepts, and there was the question of a draw on a really what's an asset to pull some cash out of it, or I think that's what you're referencing, Madam Chair, when you talk about equity. I've heard that folks have been And maybe this is new this year, given that for many years, there was no return for investing your cash. So most people let their cash sit in an account. Well, in the last year, that's changed dramatically, and people have started wisely investing their money for return. And I've heard a case where a school has bought a ladder of CDs. So some of them are longer than a year in maturity, and their auditor has told them that those longer than 1 year non-current assets are not counted towards liquidity, when they could liquidate them at any point in time. They may take an interest penalty, but the corpus there is actual marketable securities. In the corporate world, there's this sort of marketable securities. If you have something that can be sold or liquidated without any sort of friction, that is really liquidity as well. And so if we're missing that in the measure, that'd be something else we should probably think about.
I appreciate that comment so much. And I do feel like currently, and it's not just this measure, it's, our annual audit, but that there isn't always, there's almost a penalty for choosing to invest your own cash or draw down and be fiscally responsible and use your reserves. And so we already have covenants and, other people that are monitoring us on that. So, we want to encourage our schools to use the resources they have versus outside. And so factoring that in would help eliminate some of what we just talked about on this item. Are there any other comments before we move on to the next brainstorming agenda item? Okay. Believe we are on H, net assets considered under framework.
Subcommittee members, based on procedures in place when the initial financial framework was first implemented in 2012, staff has considered a charter holder's total change in net assets. Since implementing the current framework, staff has talked with various individuals regarding the appropriateness of considering donor restrictions. On the audited statement of activities, the donor restrictions section accounts for timing differences in when the revenue was recognized as required under accounting principles and when the related expenses occurred. As such, those who reached out indicated the framework should use the change in net assets without donor restrictions, which would remove the effects of timing for which the charter holder likely does not have control over and focus only on the current performance of the charter holder. Staff is proposing that the subcommittee recommend the financial framework consider net assets without donor restrictions instead of the current practice of using total net assets. This change will positively affect some charter holders and negatively affect others, just like the current practice of using total net assets does. This slide illustrates this point. While more is considered when calculating charter holders' performance on the adjusted net income measure, for simplicity's sake, the framework currently uses the red amounts from the examples on this slide for net income. If the subcommittee recommends the change proposed by staff, the framework will use the blue amounts. Due to the reason for this change, staff is proposing the subcommittee recommend the board implement this change for those charter holders that would be positively affected, like example 1, with staff's review of the fiscal year 2023 audits. In the case of examples 2, staff would continue to use the red amount for fiscal year 2023. At today's meeting, the subcommittee may decide whether to recommend the use of net assets without donor restrictions instead of the current practice of using total net assets, and if recommended, whether this change should be implemented with staff's review of the fiscal year 2023 audits for those charter holders that would be positively affected. Based on the subcommittee's decision, the subcommittee may direct staff to solicit public comment. I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Andrea. Do we have questions? I'm seeking some technical assistance so I can see the attachment.
Wendy, Andrea, so would the future then be in fiscal year 24 and 25 and 26 to use the blue when schools are positively impacted and the red when schools are negatively impacted?
My recommendation would be that, and I don't know the timing for the implementation of the changeover, but that at some point in the future, whether that's the 24 audits or the 25 audits, that everything would be done using the blue.
Okay, thank you. And if that was clear in there, I didn't see it, so. What, do we know how many schools are impacted? Would be negatively impacted by this? Or,
I do not know the numbers, but I would guess as an overall for the portfolio, it's likely going to be a wash because we currently have schools that are being, for example, in example one, we use the total net assets in their calculation, and so they were negatively affected.
Right.
And for example number two, we use the total and they were positively affected. So I have a feeling that I don't know that this is necessarily going to add more. I think it's just going to be a shift in who
Right.
is and who
But
isn't.
from fund accounting, restricted funds have conditions upon them that are outside of the control of the operator, right? And so you're saying, let's just eliminate those and see how they do with the funds that they can totally control.
Yeah. And it's been described as to me as being, and again, the charter and example two may disagree in this particular fiscal year, but it's been described to me as using the net assets without donor restrictions is a more appropriate way to look at their performance for that given year and what happened in that given year.
Okay, thank you.
I think I struggled, and this is probably just my lack of understanding of these metrics, but the why, right? And maybe, I'm sorry, maybe we've already spoken to that, but if it's a wash.
Well, the overall numbers are a wash, or could be a wash. I believe they'll be a wash. For those charter holders that are kind of in it, I believe that the including those donor restricted funds is kind of skewing that performance. And again, just as under the current practice, some are going to look better with that skewing and some aren't, but it's more critical or more important to focus on what did they what revenues were available to them in that year and what were their expenses associated with those revenues, rather than bringing in other revenues that were restricted, or on the flip side, if they received those revenues in 2022 and couldn't spend them until 2023, having that skewing of having those additional expenses, if I understand it correctly, which I may not. So
Thank you for elaborating. Member Swanson, one question.
Andrew, do we know of an example where we've counted with donor restrictions, so the red column, where that has created a situation where it has masked a failing school financially?
I can't think of an example, but it's very possible that just the taking of that action would have resulted in their dashboard looking strong. So there wouldn't have been a thought to say you're really a financially at risk or poorly performing school. But off the top of my head, I can't think of any examples of that.
I believe we have one of our experts wanting to speak. Kevin online. Are you? Some
Yeah,
feedback?
yeah, thank you. I would say two things. It's where I think it's just a cleaner view of what actually happened that year, because sometimes a nonprofit or a charter school will accumulate donor restricted donations in year X and then spend those in year Y, and that'll show as a loss in the unrestricted column in the second year. And if you really want to look at the money that was unrestricted and how they performed against their expenses, I think the left column, the without donor restrictions, just cleaner. I don't think it's a major shift, as you noted in these two examples. And you see restricted revenue is a relatively small component of charter school operations. So I don't think this is a major shift one way or the other, but I do think it's a cleaner presentation using the left column. Andrea's right. It's going to, one way or another, it's going to be a small shift, but it might help a school X and hurt school Y, but it's not going to be a big shift.
Thank you for that feedback. And Andrea, I might have misunderstood you, but you're proposing or suggesting that we do both measures and then select the one that benefits the school, or that's just a temporary, or suggesting that for a temporary period?
The recommendation, again, assuming that's the way the subcommittee wants to go, is that the calculation would be the long-term recommendation for the subcommittee is that the calculation would be changed from looking at total to looking at just without donor restrictions. Unlike other measures that we've been talking about, this recommendation includes, or proposal includes, something that could impact 2023 if that's your decision. And that would be that for those charter holders that would be positively affected, like example 1, that we would make this change beginning with the 2023 audits for them. In the example 2, we would continue doing as we are until whatever year we decide this change should be fully implemented for all schools. But we are looking or asking, again, if it's the way you want to go, that for 2023, that we would use without donor restrictions if that would positively benefit the charter holder. And then whatever the final proposal, which we won't get to today, but whatever the final proposal that this subcommittee comes up with as its recommendation to the full board for all the measures, would then identify the timing for when we would use without donor restrictions for all charter holders. I don't know if that answered the question or not.
Wendy?
Jake, did I see you lean in to comment or no? No. Okay. Maybe.
Like my fear and stuff like this is that are there unintended consequences or not, like thinking about that I'm not thinking about today. Cause I get it. On one hand, I'm a school and I get a grant, and that grant is for a playground, and I got it in June, but I'm not going to spend it till July. Those dollars are on my books. But I also get the other side where you don't want to take it away, and all of a sudden it looks like the school's lost revenue. Hey, you lost $70,000 because you did what the grant said. So my instincts are kind of tracking right here, but this one might be another good one that we can help get the word out to the field. I'm like, am I missing something? Or is there situations where, like, unrestricted is good, right? Spending on whatever you want, that's cash. Restricted is restricted. So I don't know. My instincts are maybe let the field chew on this one a little bit and you all revisit it at the December meeting, but I don't know. Am I thinking about that right, John?
Wendy?
Do you have a view?
Yeah, and I don't, this is not one we spend a lot of time worrying about. So I'm not quite sure how the whole accounting representation versus actual cash impact plays out. But I would say both, just philosophically, it's my belief that in 2018, what we tried to do is move from an accrual accounting view of financials to a current cash operations view. And that both this one and the next one are trying to, I think, move us, make sure we're clear that we're still working on a cash unrestricted available resources basis. And in my mind, I think philosophically, all of them should, to be consistent, try to be in that place. And some of these things, I think, maybe just we need to look at definitions that can be more broadly interpreted to take into account what is a cash and non-cash expense, or revenue and restricted and unrestricted.
I continue to feel like multi-years is critical too, to look at these measures. I think I would agree the field needs time to give feedback.
Yeah,
Where you at on
and
it?
if I were to make a motion today, it might sound something like this, that, the audits for 2023 are about completed or soon to be completed, right? And I would agree that perhaps staff looks at 2023 where only the good guys count for our measures, and we ask for staff to come back and give us some sort of sense overall the portfolio, how that impacted, maybe look at some outliers, because there may be some crazy exceptions that are really weird. I don't know either way. And that I don't think this my personal opinion is this subcommittee, I don't think we'll be ready to make a decision on this until we have more of that data, which is going to take longer than this subcommittee lasts to germinate, in my opinion. So I'm going to try to make a motion. Can I try? Give me a second here. Based upon a review of the meeting materials and subcommittee's deliberations, I move that the subcommittee recommend that the financial performance framework consider charter holders' net assets without restrictions instead of total net assets. That the board implement this change for the charter holders that would be positively affected with staff's review of the fiscal 2023 year audits. It would not impact schools that are negatively impacted by this change for the fiscal year 2023 audits. Further, I move to direct staff to solicit public comment on the subcommittee's recommendation for the fiscal 2023 audits in accordance with the board's procedures for rule and policy adoption, and to place the matter on the board's December 14th, 2023 agenda for the second opportunity for public comment and consideration and possible action by the full board. However, this action on this item may continue to future board meetings based on data developed by staff.
I second that very wordy motion.
Member Ruiz,
Aye.
Member Swanson,
Aye.
Superintendent Designee Miller,
Aye.
motion passes.
Prior to moving on to agenda item I, I'd like to suggest a 5-minute break.
quickly take roll as we come back. Make sure we have our 3 members. Member Ruiz,
Here.
Member Stratton, Member Swanson,
I am here.
Superintendent Designee Miller.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. All right, we are moving on to agenda item I, non-cash expenses and unusual items. And we appreciate Andrea preparing a presentation to start this agenda item.
Subcommittee members, the adjusted net income measure considers the difference between the charter holder's total revenues and adjusted total expenses. Adjusted total expenses equals total expenses minus non-cash expenses. Under the financial framework, non-cash expenses may include depreciation, amortization, and write-offs of loan issuance costs and prepayment penalties. On the revenue side, the adjusted net income measure currently does not remove one-time non-recurring revenues when determining a charter holder's adjusted net income. As a result, a charter holder's ability to cover its regular expenses with ongoing revenues may be inflated under the current calculation. Prior to the subcommittee being formed, the board received feedback about expanding the non-cash expenses definition to include certain facility lease expenses and unrealized losses on investments. Regarding lease expense, generally accepted accounting principles or GAAP require the expenses incurred over the term of a long-term operating lease agreement be expensed on a straight line basis over the term of the lease. The impact of this is that expenses in the first half of the lease term are typically higher each year than what the landlord requires the tenant to pay under the lease agreement. Conversely, the expenses in the second half of the lease term are typically less than the rent amount required to be paid. This slide includes an example from the meeting materials that illustrates this point. Using this example, stakeholders have requested that for year 1 and year 2, the $50,000 difference between the actual lease payment and the GAAP amount included on the audited financial statements be considered a non-cash expense under the financial framework. Regarding the other item mentioned in the public comment, an unrealized loss on investments occurs when the value of the investments has decreased, but the investments have not yet been sold. It is staff's understanding that this is considered unrealized because it only exists on paper. On the revenue side, staff is proposing the adjusted net income formula be changed to remove one-time non-recurring cash or non-cash revenues. Recent examples from charter holders' audits include donations of property and gains from the early termination of leases. This would more accurately capture the charter holder's ability to cover its regular expenses with ongoing revenues. At today's meeting, the subcommittee may decide to modify the financial framework's current definition for non-cash expenses and/or may decide whether to recommend removing one-time non-recurring revenues from the adjusted net income calculation. In addition, the subcommittee may direct staff to solicit public comment on any proposed changes, which the subcommittee would consider at its next meeting. I'm available for questions.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I'd actually like to consider a motion to move this agenda item for discussion under J, because I feel like it's a little backwards. Like I feel like discussing multi-year net income considerations might need to be considered or at least discussed before this. Do any board members have an issue with that? Okay, so I'd like to make a motion to continue the agenda item I conversation after agenda item J.
I'll second that.
Mr. Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Swanson,
Aye.
Superintendent Designee Miller.
Aye.
Motion passes.
All right, so then to be most prepared to discuss these, we will first see this presentation for adjusted net income trends consideration, also by Andrea.
This is a brainstorming item. The discussion with staff will provide staff with a better idea of how to proceed and what to prepare for the subcommittee's December meeting. Currently, the financial framework's adjusted net income measure considers only 1 year of performance when assigning the measure rating. As indicated on this slide, a charter holder must have positive adjusted net income to receive a meet standard. To distinguish between approaches standard and below standard performance, the measure considers the charter holder's adjusted net income divided by total revenues, or put another way, the charter holder's adjusted total margin. For this agenda item, staff is wanting to know whether staff should proceed with developing a proposal for the framework's adjusted net income measure that would consider multiple years of performance instead of the current one, and if so, how that might be accomplished. The next slide for today's meeting includes possible questions the subcommittee may use but does not have to use to guide this discussion. To provide a starting point for this discussion if needed, the slides for today's meeting also include a table that summarizes the measures used by the National Association of Charter School Authorizers and the Nevada State Public Charter Schools Authority. In its performance audit and sunset review of the board, the Arizona Auditor General compared the board to Nevada. I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Andrea. I'd love to put maybe our technical panel on the spot a little and ask if you feel like this might capture unusual or 1 year instances in looking at it from a multi-year perspective for trends. Kevin, I'm not sure. I think your hand is up from before, but it might be new. Were you?
It is.
Like to
It's
speak to
new.
this? Thank you.
Yeah. Just philosophically, I think a multi-year approach, although it complicates it a little bit, is because income can, operations you can have 1 year blips for, it could be COVID, it could be planned, it could be budgeted. And then you can adjust. If you look at a multi-year approach, I think it's just a better comparison. It kind of smooths out random swings one way or the other. So, I mean, that's just more philosophical than technical. I'd be curious to see what John thinks.
Thanks, Kevin.
Me too. Me too, John.
I'm mixed on this one. Generally, what have you done for me lately is what I would be most concerned about, and that again, like the multi-year cash concept, what has most recently happened is generally most indicative of what's going on in the school. I could see where if there's a consistent year-over-year increase or a year-over-year decrease, that there's a trend that you could draw from that could be helpful, but it could be complicated and could be full of a lot of other exceptions. So I'm conflicted as to how much this would really pick up, but at the same time add a degree of complication that's not there now. I don't really know what the answer is, honestly.
Go ahead, Jim.
Wendy, John, to your point, I agree. But in reviewing the Nevada stuff, I think it may address your issue because it's meet standard is the most recent year is positive and the 3 year is positive. Does not meet is the 3 year total is negative or the most recent year is negative. And the fall far is below is 3 years is negative and the current year is negative. So it kind of addresses it weights current year more heavily. And so
When I don't know how I'm struggling a bit. Maybe next time we have a little bit more time to review the agenda in advance, because I just don't know that we can brainstorm each of these items separately, because to me, this one is critical unless we're taking some action on like the use of cash reserves. So for me personally, where trends comes into play is when, a school has made a conscious decision to perhaps not have a positive, because we're nonprofits, right? We're not intended to make a profit every year. So feel like only looking at 1 year at a time incentivizes, not making choices to use reserves or to ebb and flow. As I believe it was Jessica last month that was here that was talking about, our school made a very conscious decision this year that we would not be, on the black, we would be going the other direction because we were making some structural changes. So it may not, it just needs to be accounted for in one way or another. So if we don't land on multiple years, perhaps it's under the options for cash reserves or how we're calculating the net income. But right now, I don't feel like our metrics provide for that effectively.
Madam Chair, I agree. And that definitely be the case when you're making an investment in a program that would be treated as an expense and not a capital item that would be amortized. And so that is a good point as to trying to capture exceptions. In our world, or my former world, we would, and I think some of those who were there last week and heard the folks from S&P talk, those kind of, we'd view those as non-recurring expenses that we would take into account when we're undergoing a credit review that we would back out and wouldn't count against. But when purely looked at from an accounting perspective, would be an expense, would result in a negative net, or could result in a negative or smaller net income in one particular year that would not be indicative of what you would expect in any other year because of that one-time expense. So that'd be one way. This would be one way to smooth that out. That perhaps wouldn't require, as Heather had suggested, every school has a programmatic expense like that coming to the board every year and trying to make an explanation as to why it shouldn't be accounted, and the board having to make a qualitative decision as to whether they should not include it or not, or whether they should include it or not.
Thank you, John. And I know we've just sort of started the conversation, so you probably haven't, my goodness, I don't even know how you got all of this work done, but is your sense, Andrea, that this would be considerably harder, like to calculate? Like it certainly complicates the metric. How do you feel just on that workload practicality side?
If this measure is implemented, this would be incorporated into our system, our online system. So those changes to have the information or the years of data that we need available would be built in. So it wouldn't, there'd be the time involved to get the system up to par, but after that, it would be fairly straightforward in calculating. So I don't think it would add too much difficult. I mean, while the calculation is more complex and there's more years of data, in terms of on the ground, doing it for our office, I don't think it would add significant time or effort to the framework.
And worked into the formula could be, if it was stakeholder feedback, it could be weighted for the, most current year, those kinds of things. You could work that in.
I think incorporating stakeholder, let me clarify. By stakeholder feedback, do you mean we would be putting something out and they would be commenting, or do you mean I received a below and now I want to provide information as to why I got a below? That would add more time.
Sure. Yeah. I guess, if there's an appetite, like based on the stakeholder feedback that we get right now for the subcommittee work, if there's an appetite to consider this 3 year, you could work that weighting. And if weighting was something that the community felt would make this measure more appropriate, that could be worked in as well.
Absolutely. Whatever comes out over this process is going to have to identify how those ratings are assigned and whether that's weighted or other things, that's all going to have to be part of what goes out. So absolutely, yes.
And then is there fear, this question is probably for both of you, and is there fear that this could potentially, we'd miss a school? Like, is there fear? Because in my mind, we are waiting, like we are not taking we're measuring it each year. So each year they have another opportunity to fall into it. But do you fear that you won't see those schools that have started to struggle?
It probably depends on how that weighting occurs or the thresholds. I think if there is some sort of combination between the 3-year and what happened in the current year, I think we likely would still be capturing everybody, not saying that the thresholds that we have currently in place for like our 1-year approach is the way it should be in the proposal that goes forward. I struggle with this because it's a balancing act of trying to get those who should be in intervention, and to keep those that really don't need to be out but are kind of getting tripped up out. And so at this point in time, haven't had a whole lot of time to think about it, but this point in time, I'm thinking that there needs to be some sort of combination of the 3-year average and what happened in the most recent year, but not necessarily that the targets that we currently have in place for evaluating that audited year performance need to carry over. There may be other things that are factored in, or they can carry over.
Any other thoughts on this, comments, feedback? Do my fellow subcommittee members, are you interested enough in this to see some data like we have on some of the other discussion topics in our next meeting? Member Ruiz, do you have, what's your sense on this one?
Yeah, this is kind of, it looks like we're addressing this because of the Auditor General. Because the whole Nevada thing versus that was kind of something that the Auditor General in their sunset review was bringing up, correct?
Well, I think we maybe have pulled this Nevada example because of that obsession,
Okay.
but no, this was really something that was important to me because I feel like
Yeah.
our current metrics are missing trends. Like we're not watching trends, we're making these decisions one and done.
Yep. And I think is there a way to, I kind of like how that ADM, how we were able to look at its effect on the portfolio. Is that a lot? Is doing something like this, that's I guess averaging multiple years is could it be done on a sample or I don't.
Yeah, Andrew, do you think that would be possible without too much?
Yeah, if you guys could give some direction, and I know there are just slight differences between the calculations are pretty much the same, but in terms of the target or the meets does not meet under their terminology and below, if you would, I think that is possible to do that for the portfolio, and if you'd like that run on kind of using the NACSA or the Nevada or both, or if there's some other kind of cuts or consideration that you would like done, I think that would be possible for the December.
I wonder if you just ran the sample on the meets. If somebody's currently meets and you change it and all of a sudden you see them not meeting, then anybody below the meets is going to get it, is going to be in more trouble. Would that be a correct assumption?
I think that's a good question because we're not wanting to make this more punitive. We're wanting to provide more opportunities for schools to ebb and flow.
I'm being silent because I think that this is here just for discussion purposes, and I think I would like something more developed in a proposal come to us, I guess.
Yeah. I think there is an appetite to continue the discussion. So individually, I think we can review some of these suggestions on where to do those cut scores and just maybe send you a little bit of feedback on which direction to take this for some sample proposal data or where those cut scores should be. Any other comments online before we move on from this? All right, so we're going to circle back now and look at the non-cash expenses and unusual items. And we've already seen the presentation, so now it's just open for discussion. One question I did have on this, Andrea, like I'm assuming this is not considering grants. Like we wouldn't, like if we were doing ESSER again, we're not suggesting that we would remove that type of non-recurring revenue, or are we?
That was not what I envisioned with this. I might need more technical advice on whether that's appropriate. I was envisioning more of the real random or unique things that are happening that are causing and inflating their numbers. I think the ESSER monies actually would, or similar types of monies would kind of be associated with your operating, or I would consider it part of what would be kind of your operations rather than some unique item like a donation of land or something that would be, or that would come into place. But it sounds like John maybe has something, I don't know. You move, so I.
Yeah, again, like I mentioned earlier, I think this is more, in my mind, this is more about trying to make sure that we capture the philosophy of looking at current year revenues and expenses that are real cash flows to the school. And that I'm not even sure why I'd make the case that the two expenses here don't really need a specific mention. The adjustment, again, this is maybe the non-practicing lawyer in me, says that the non-cash expenses may include depreciation, amortization, but may means that other things can be included that are not in the list of definitions. Maybe we just need to look at a defined term of what a non-cash expense is without going through a laundry list of what everyone might be within an accounting context. On the revenue side, I think you're calling them one-time non-recurring, but this is also a non-cash expense, a gain like this, a property donation that's recognized as revenue, but is not cash to the school. I think it's the same concept on the other side of the ledger, and that definitionally we could make it broad enough that those things could be captured. Now, the flip side to that is, Andrea, whether, when you guys are trying to capture and calculate what should be accepted, whether you have the necessary information within an audit. Generally we would find those things not only in the notes and the statement of cash flows, have to pick through those things. Sometimes have to ask questions of auditors and schools to actually understand that. So, the tough thing may be trying to find the balance to make that operationally from the board's perspective efficient, but capturing the philosophical goal in my mind of trying to make these things reflect the current year cash operations of the school.
Like our auditors, they don't pull these out for adjusted net income, or they do? Does that make sense? When an audit is completed, and I realize I should probably know this, but I feel like I've gotten a few things mixed in my head now. But as far as determining our position for audit, how are these one time?
Well, Kevin can probably speak to this in more detail, but these things are accounted for however, the accounting gap standards tell them to.
Right.
And so there are things that they include as expenses that are not cash expenditures. There are things that they include as revenues that are not revenue receipt or cash receipts in a particular year. However, some of them are perhaps subsumed in other line items. Or, for example, if you look at this revenue expenditure statement here, they have two line items for expenses, program expenses and management in general. So I suppose when Andrea sees, or the system Andrea is overseeing sees something like this, the next thing you do is you go to the notes of the financial statements or the statement of cash position and look for those things that you generally understand to not be cash flows, depreciation, gains, donations. But again, it does take a little bit more of a little more vetting of the financial statements than just simply loading them in and letting the ratios come out of them.
Wendy, Andrea, can you explain again where this proposal is coming from?
Related to the one-time non-recurring revenues, that is coming from staff because they were not sure that the current focus of the definition allowed those items to be removed and in the calculation. In terms of looking at changes to the non-cash expenses definition, that has come, or at least the two items that are reflected in the materials came from public comment to say that those things should be included. I think to John's point, I think if there is a way, if it's appropriate to define all of this as we're going to look at the cash flow statement, and if something is reflected as kind of or is determined to be non-cash, we will subtract that, and we'll make those adjustments that way. I think a generic definition could work. I think while it gets us into this position of I think of staff not knowing whether they should be or shouldn't be doing something. And by defining everything or identifying everything, it can also give clarity. But if the position is if an expense is non-cash and you can tell that from the cash flow statement, you should just remove that. That would make it easy for all of us to kind of figure out if there is some nuance to that, which I don't know if there is. Then that is where it's helpful to identify as much as possible what we're going to be doing and what we're not going to be doing if there is anything on that other end.
Thank you, Andrea. So I think, and I'd go back to the technical panel on this, but why aren't we just looking at the statement of cash flows as a indicator? And that takes the subjectivity out of determining what is which or not, what's an expense, what's an unusual item, what's one time. I could make a lot of reasons why one-time revenues make sense because you're going to spend the money then, or it's going to go hit your balance sheet and you got equity. So maybe it's just asking you guys can either trending or looking at the statement of cash flows be an indicator that will achieve your results.
Kevin, were you trying to speak to this?
Yeah, the statement of cash flows will give you a good roadmap. It might not, Andrea might not give you everything, but for instance, if you had a non-cash donation of land, that would show up on the statement of cash flows because it's in net income, but it's a non-cash event. The operating lease straight lining, there is a disclosure at the bottom of the statement of cash flow. It says the amount of cash spent on rent, which then you'd have to compare to what is in the income statement for actual rent expense, and then the difference would be a reduction. So that's that's a little bit of work to get to that, because GAAP expense for rent isn't equal to cash. And I know I can see why members would bring this forward, because it's, if you're running a school, you think about what you have to pay for rent in this year. And if you're expensing much more on that, you feel like that. Of course, that can go the other way when you get to the latter half of the lease, where you actually pay more than what's hitting your income statement, and that deferred rent liability goes down. So yeah, I think your cash flow could be a good guide. It would definitely identify non-cash donations that are significant on the statement of cash flows, which should be pulled out, because those are one time, and they don't affect your liquidity at all.
So Kevin, this is John. If the definition of non-cash expenses remain the same, which was total expenses, or I'm sorry, the numerator remained the same, which I think is total expenses less non-cash expenses, and we change the revenues to say total revenues less non-cash revenues, and that non-cash revenues or non-cash expenses were then defined as revenues or expenses outlined either on the school's statement of cash flows or in an associated footnote to the audited financial statements, so that staff, they are in that audit. They don't have to ask or get a special interpretation. They're in that audit. And that if a school wants these things to be considered, they need to make sure that it's being reflected in one of those two places in that audit. Is that a workable solution? Like, you as an auditor, would you be able to take that direction and include it? I know you would include what you're designated to include within the statement of cash flows, but could you, if something like this lease schedule didn't quite fit, would you be able to add a note under your standards that would then allow state board staff to identify those sorts of non-cash revenues and expenses?
The answer is yes, because the new lease accounting, which you probably are aware of, FASB 842, added disclosures. So you could actually grab the rent expense and the cash paid for rent from the statement of cash flows and the note disclosures. So yes, I mean, I think that's the most workable way. And then you can work with your audit firm to make sure that they've identified these things in the note disclosures. But any significant non-cash item should be in the cash flow statement. So I think that should be the easiest way to drive this. And the other thing that comes up a lot is when there's bond refinancing. So you write off the issuance costs. That's been a big non-cash item, but that's it should be identified in the statement of activities and the cash flow statement. So yeah, I like your suggestion. Long answer short, or short answer long, I guess.
So it sounds like that takes care of that. Great. Any other comments before we move on to the next item? Okay. So jumping to item K, discussion surrounding options to you.
Before, could you
Yes.
make, this was kind of an action or a potential action item. So could you make a motion, and if part of your motion, then we would put this out for public comment as well, if that's what you would like.
What exactly would need to be captured in the motion?
I think the language that was provided, kind of the standard just one second. think the second option would be what we would be sufficient.
I move that upon a review of the meeting materials and the subcommittee's deliberations, move that the subcommittee continue this discussion and consideration of agenda item I to the December 1st, 2023 meeting of the subcommittee, and that the subcommittee take no action at this time. Further direct board staff to solicit preliminary public comment on the suggestions made today for measuring non-cash and unusual items for a period of not less than 5 business days, and report the results of the public comment to the subcommittee at its December 1st, 2023 meeting.
Second.
Member Ruiz,
Aye.
Member Swanson,
Aye.
and Superintendent Designee Miller.
Aye.
Motion passes.
All right, so now we're going to discuss options to use cash reserves. I know this, as mentioned previously, is really important to me. And I think a lot of other charter operators, how these cash reserve expenses are considered by the board, knowing that we're also being encouraged to have a certain amount of cash on hand. So sometimes we need to spend some of it. So I believe we're going to start this agenda item with another presentation from Andrea.
Subcommittee members, this is a brainstorming item. The discussion will provide staff with a better idea of how to proceed and what to prepare for the subcommittee's December meeting. This slide includes examples from the meeting materials that give the subcommittee additional context for this discussion beyond the previously submitted written feedback. Accumulating net income year over year creates cash reserves that a charter holder cannot access in many cases without having negative net income. With negative adjusted net income, the charter holder cannot receive a meet standard on the financial framework's adjusted net income measure. As adjusted net income serves as a starting point for determining if the charter holder can cover its facility and debt costs, this also affects the charter holder's performance on the lease adjusted debt service coverage ratio measure. For this agenda item, staff is wanting to know whether, for charter holders with a solid financial position, staff should proceed with developing a proposal that would allow them to use their cash reserves without being penalized under the financial framework, and if so, how that might be accomplished. The next slide for today's meeting includes possible questions the subcommittee may use but does not have to use to guide this discussion. I'm available for questions.
Wendy? Andrea? How often does this happen?
I think the question really probably gets to more of how many schools end up in intervention because of this.
Yeah.
I think it can happen a lot because charter holders are spending that down. I think the bigger concern is how they end up in intervention. Looking at these examples on the screen, these 3 charter holders, because there were 2 associated with Charter A, represent 10% of the charter holders that were identified for first-time intervention. So the numbers may be small, but when it gets to a certain point, it is kind of moving schools into intervention. And again, I know these schools have significant, cash reserves. I don't know what the appropriate threshold is if we look at cash reserves, but these 3 represent 10% of the charter holders that were identified for first-time intervention based on the 22 audits.
I would venture to say too, there may be decisions made to avoid going into intervention. So there maybe are more situations where a school would want
Is not
to,
doing
is not doing this so that it
something that
is
could be
not
very
reflect
productive
negative.
for
Yes,
positive
absolutely.
for kids.
Absolutely. Or like investing in your own facility, paying down your debt, those things generally we're shying away from so that we make this measure. Member Ruiz, do you have any comments or thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, I I just think if you have, especially given with interest rates, and it just seems if you have money and you're not harming your position, you need some flexibility on how, what you do with some of your cash reserves, and just to let it sit there and not use it and take on debt, or all because it's going to show up on some sort of dashboard. It just seems not. I wouldn't want to have these kind of restrictions, to be saying, well, I'm going to be on some sort of dashboard and therefore I can't use these funds or that fund, these funds or those funds for, to put my business in a better position.
Thank you for that feedback. I also think there are other ways for this to be captured. Like this is going to be captured in a school's annual audit, right? They're going to be in the red if they went over. So for accountability purposes, I don't think that the schools lose any accountability for us to take to create an exception or a way for schools to still present green and meet the standard while using their reserves. Jake, please, you have a comment?
Yeah. I'm sure at the risk of making this meeting longer, I would disagree with Chairman Ruiz, or excuse me, Member Ruiz. I think as much flexibility as you guys are comfortable with is a good thing. There's all kinds of different things that come up in a given year, the investment side of it. So to the extent you guys are comfortable, I think giving schools as much flexibility is helpful in this one. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Any other comments on this item?
I'll just say, Wendy, that I think that if schools are performing in a way that isn't in the best interest of the school in order to make a checklist, then, and no criticism to staff, then we're not doing the best thing that we can be doing. So, but one of the things I fear, or a concern, not a fear, but a concern I have, is that we've created a framework of objective data. That is, we have these data points and it points to X, Y, and Z. Now, when you have a situation like this, do we create an environment where we have the ability for staff or the executive director to do a management override of the finding and, negate it because of some sort of special circumstance? Like, well, we got 3 years of cash on hand and we spent it on some stuff that we needed and went to a loss because of it. Well, that to me says, well, they're doing good. They're doing the right thing, or potentially, most likely. So with all of these, every one of these, we're kind of getting into more subjectivity, and I want to make sure that we've got our objective stuff, and then what do we do with the outliers or the things that spin out of that? And that's what I think we're trying to solve here. So I don't know how to solve that, but I think the issue, if we're causing schools to act, charters act, maybe not in their own best interest, I don't want to do that. So that's just a comment.
I think like staffing is big on this one, because when you have and you spend money and invest in your team and train them, and that's one of the few things. If revenue is not changing, you've got to adjust expenses, and that's one of the quick expenses. And so I hate creating a climate where those mid-year changes might be made not in the best interest of kids. So I do think, and I think I hear sentiment to ask staff to proceed with developing a proposal, but I do think it's important to Member Swanson's points to, how do we make that still objective, right? How do we not make it a you guys decide? Is it perhaps that one of these measures, can be set aside if the others are all meeting one time, not each year, something like that? Any other feedback? Wide open for ideas for staff to incorporate into the proposal on this. John?
It's difficult because the situation in which any individual school might choose to use its cash can be widely varied. I think what the board and staff here needs to try to find the balance between is allowing schools to use their cash for prudent advancement of the charter, but not masking, not to use it to mask that there's problems, that they can't otherwise meet their budget. And that just because they have some cash now, they mask it by using it, but they won't have that cash next year or the next year when this continues to happen. So you want to make sure you don't miss those things. Just one thought I have, but again, this is kind of in the exception, but it needs to be documented in some fashion. If a school is going to make an investment in a program, in an additional staff member, from cash that they've accumulated over time, that perhaps that they need to provide as part of their, consideration for the various metrics, a formal, like a board resolution that recognizes that this is not a recurring expense, that we're choosing to make this in the best interest of the school. That sort of thing, so that it can be objectively taken into account, but formally recognized by board action, that they're utilizing this cash as opposed to, and we're just kind of slipping on our revenue and our ADM. So we're going to use some of our cash, and then it's getting worse, and we're going to use more of our cash, and and then you got a problem before the get out of jail free period is over.
I think that's actually critical. I think it's very prudent to say, does that organization's governing body know and understand, and are there minutes? Because I know that concern about the subjectivity, and maybe that can just be an objective benchmark. Are there some minutes throughout the year where the board themselves discussed, their financial, because I think that's the end goal, right? We're wanting our organizations and our schools to be more fiscally responsible themselves, and to be watching these and to put in metrics in their organizations that line up with ours. So I do think whether their organization knows about it is important in the conversation. Andrea, Ashley, do you feel like that's enough to?
Madam Chair, just a few thoughts. When into the credit of John and others that are working with the schools, the board has worked really hard administratively to, somewhat reduce the burden on charters to have to submit to us, and then also for own staff to have to follow up with schools. So maybe there's some suggestions here is if the school is in intervention, maybe we look to get that resolution through that quarterly process, or that intervention process. But then in establishing where the charter may fall within the metrics or on the framework, is to try to figure out an objective way, because I would hate for us to have to go back and forth with the charter to figure out where the minutes are, or that specific requirement to change the measure under the framework when we're reviewing the audits. So maybe it's trying to make sure it's a clean review when reviewing the audit, and setting a threshold. If we want to look back at the unrestricted days liquidity or another measure, based on how much they spent in that reserve, are they still meeting under days liquidity? So really taking that subjectivity out of it, taking that administrative burden off the schools. Again, we can look at it from an intervention perspective if we need to, but I think if there is a way, and be happy to think through this a little bit more, but if there is a way to have an objective standard when looking at the audit, I think that would be most helpful for staff. But I'll hand that over to Andrea, because I'm sure he has a comment about that.
Yeah, and I would agree with that as well, to the extent possible. And I don't know if it's the unrestricted days liquidity, but if there is a threshold of, if a school has X number of days liquidity, when we're looking at the audit and they have, below ratings on adjusted net income or lease adjusted, that could move them either to an approaches or a meets if they have, and maybe that's available to them for a year. But if they have a higher threshold, like some of the examples that were on the screen, like they have like 3 or 4 years of liquidity in the bank that they can continue, we would kind of include as, and it can be whatever level that would be appropriate. We can make the below at approaches, we can make the below a meets, but that would be one of the cut points is if you have X number of days liquidity, then this kind of automatically becomes an approaches or becomes a meets. And that could be in those cases with schools that have large reserves, however that's defined, that could continue until they hit some floor. And for maybe others, the threshold could be set where maybe they can use that for a year or maybe 2 years. And then if it continues, maybe we need to put them in intervention or whatever. But that would be, if it's possible and if it makes sense, that would be really helpful for staff and help all of us to know kind of what that threshold is and when other things may have to kick in.
And it'll be easier to, get your head around with maybe some numbers on that. But I mean, that seems like a reasonable and transparent way to approach the next steps in this conversation to me.
Does anyone have any ideas as to, I don't know, in my head, it seems like, and I don't know that this is reasonable, it's just something I struggle with. It seems like you should have more than whatever our meets threshold is, but I don't know what, if it's like a month more or 2 months more, if you need to have, significant times more because we are kind of waiving that opportunity to kind of look and make sure that the school is in a solid position. I mean, it's a little easier with the ones where we continue it on, but where that threshold would be for schools, whether it be a one-time or a two-time kind of opportunity.
I tend to agree that it starts above whatever becomes the new minimum for days cash on hand, right? So if ultimately we move forward with 60, which we haven't yet, so we maybe would need to look at a couple of different thresholds here, but being over our meets with your cash then shouldn't enable you to spend it. I mean, so I do think that probably cumulatively, if you have a few years, then I don't think it needs to be a red mark until it's really, I think some of the other measures are going to start to trend as well. I do think that's where that, and so maybe like looking at board minutes is not the right way to say it. I guess if the school is not put into intervention, like we make these exceptions and these schools don't go into intervention, I guess the sense is I feel like their boards should still be notified that this is being watched and perhaps review a resolution, or, like that they should have the ability to be part of the conversation with their school leaders if they're not hands-on in that way, versus, using that as your metric, including them. I don't know. What do my other members think?
Wendy, we could establish a measurement for excess cash that could be used. It'd be the prior year excess cash. Does it cover this year's losses by X? I don't know. I have no idea. Or, and I'm not a fund accountant, but if you're looking at, is there equity in the business at some level, just measuring is it net assets in fund accounting? Yeah. So are there net assets at some level, some multiple of something or whatever? You potentially look at that. But I also think that these instances are probably, Andrea, 10% of the population, maybe. I don't know. On 500 schools, 50 schools a year, or whatever, or 50 audits a year. I don't know. Is this something where we give staff some discretion to say, yes, the check boxes say X, but we've evaluated the totality of the situation and have determined a management override?
Madam Chair and Member Swanson, and based on feedback that we've received over the last couple of years, I think my recommendation would be keep board staff's discretion out of the determination. And I think, leaving it to the auditors, right? Leaving it to the auditors to provide the numbers and us to do the calculations behind the scenes is probably best. And quite frankly, I think it's more transparent to the charters about what they would likely be rated on our framework.
I greatly appreciate you thinking of net assets though, because we're not really looking at that right now in our liquidity numbers, and that's super relevant to whether or not you can spend some of your resources.
Madam Chair, and just another thought too, in hearing your comments, I think that there is ways that we could bring in the charter's own governing bodies and making sure that they're either like we're informing them or that we can require certain documentation to us. So we can look at that. And I can see an avenue for us to create those processes outside of the measures actually being marked, like how we would mark up. If you're in this situation, then we can have a discussion with the charter, or we can require certain documentation to be submitted to us. So.
Do you guys feel like you have enough to move forward on our proposal?
Yeah, I like what Ashley just said, because if we're dealing with 10%, it's I think it gives some individuality to the situation, instead of coming up with some framework that everybody's being measured by and only a few people are really being able to use it. So I kind of like what Ashley said.
Thank you, Emery.
I would always say at work, you'll never get fired for doing the right thing. And so have we ever closed down a school for having a red mark when they're actually not deserving of in totality?
We haven't. I think what keeps popping up in my mind though is if we're not laying out what the requirements are there schools that aren't doing things because of that? But no, we haven't, and I don't anticipate you guys would. You'd look at those circumstances, but it's kind of trying to put something into place that will allow schools to feel comfortable making those decisions that they believe will benefit their school, and knowing if they make that decision, what's going to happen under the framework, and having a clear idea of what's going to happen going into that decision. And hopefully with these changes, giving at least certain schools the comfort to make those decisions and move forward in that way.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think sometimes, the closing of the school is the worst thing you can imagine, but there are other negative consequences to the schools based on these dashboards. If they really start to trend looking dismal, then a lot of opportunities for that school start to close. And so it kind of just makes their situation a little bit worse instead of empowering them to turn it around. Thank you for a really rich discussion on this item. I think we will move on to debt principal, agenda item L. And maybe in discussing this presentation, Andrea, you could tell us the why, how this one ended up on the agenda as well.
Sure. Subcommittee members, this is the last brainstorming item. The calculation for the lease adjusted debt service coverage ratio measure considers as applicable the charter holder's debt principal, interest expense, and facility lease expense. Under the financial framework, debt principal includes principal payments associated with bonds or loans for a charter holder that purchases its facilities, as well as other long-term loans obtained by the charter holder and capital leases. Many charter holders obtain equipment or vehicles such as buses through capital leases, which are now referred to as finance leases under accounting principles. For the ratios calculation, staff pulls the debt principal amount from the audited statement of cash flows. Please note that previously principal to be paid during the next fiscal year was used in the calculation. This was changed for the current framework so that all amounts used in the calculation pertain to the audited fiscal year. In most cases, using the amount from the cash flow statement works well. However, there are certain situations, such as when the charter holder pays off its debt early or when a balloon payment must be made, where using the amount found on the audited statement of cash flow skews a charter holder's performance. In these situations, obviously paying off debt early, well, in both of these situations, likely the charter holder has planned for these actions and has determined that it is in the school's best interest and that they can still remain on a solid foundation after these are made. But by using that full amount, let me back up. That full payment wasn't relying on what that charter holder did in the particular year that they made that payment. They've been building up to that. And so we're kind of looking at, by using the amount from the statement of cash flows, we're looking at comparing that full amount payment to what they generated for that particular year, which I would say probably 99+% of the time, they are not going to generate in that audited year when they make that balloon payment or they decide to pay off their debt. They are not going to have net income that equals or exceeds that amount. Other situations that have come up, which can be kind of skewed in looking at that performance, is when they refinance their debt, or just the question of when the school pays their principal using bond reserves. Is that something that the measure should be including in the calculation? So that's kind of, I don't know if that helps understand where it came from. Similar to the other agenda items, we're just kind of wanting to know whether the measure should be modified to handle one or more of these situations in a different way and how that might be accomplished. And the slide includes some discussion, but you guys can proceed however you would like. And I am available for questions.
You, Andrea, is there any of our three quote unquote experts who would like to take a stab at how they feel about this one? Thanks, John.
Madam Chair, I mean, I think this is, it's like the last discussion. These are unique situations where either they've refinanced debt, they've saved up money and decided to pay down some of their extra debt, and so it's an exception. It's use of cash or that's not part of their typical operating budget. And so I'm not sure, without having some sort of qualitative feedback from the school, how these things would be adjusted. I mean, typically in our world, if we're looking at someone's coverage ratio, we'd be looking at their scheduled payments of principal and interest, and these exceptional, maybe not exceptional, but non-scheduled type of events, perhaps paying a little bit of debt off early or refinancing it entirely, are not really considered as part of that annual burden, because it's either a one-time event of use of cash or it's a replacement of one debt obligation with another with its own schedule. A balloon payment the same way, as long as they either have the money to pay off the balloon payment and therefore they're out of debt, so it doesn't really matter anymore, or they're able to refinance the balloon payment. So I don't know how you definitionally, deal with these particular occasional circumstances without, some specific request for adjustment by the school. I don't know, Kevin, from your perspective as an auditor and what you put in the audit, do you think that there's information in there that, not to put you on the spot, but that there's information in there that the staff could make the appropriate adjustments to take into account the school's true economic burden in any particular year, where there might be a refinancing or repayment of debt outside of its schedule, its regular schedule?
Well, no, I mean, if it's a scheduled balloon payment, you'd have a source of cash to when you presumably you refinanced it. If you just accelerated your payments and you paid more debt down, that's just going to show up on the cash flow statement as a use of cash. So there's nothing extraordinary that would be identified in the cash flow statement. But more often you have a balloon payment on a 20-year note that has a 10-year amortization. In year 10, you would have a source of cash and a use of cash. So you maybe could take into account the proceeds from the new debt to offset the proceeds that went out to pay off the old debt. But if you're just making accelerated principal payments, that's just going to show up in the cash flow statement as a use of cash.
I agree with John. I don't know that we should manage to the exception on this. It is, I think, the bigger question is, are schools prepared for these events? Right? Not that the events occur, are they prepared for them? And that's what we should be doing in the prior years. And maybe we end up on some of these things where do we allow schools to put a written response in to their red, yellow, greens?
Currently, our dashboard does not allow for that.
Well, maybe we allow for the schools to have a response to our dashboard to explain anomalies, and that becomes part of the permanent file. And we don't respond to it, but we can read it and decide if we believe it or not. I don't know, but something like this, I think, is just we're getting. I feel like we're starting to just try to manage to exceptions, and that's a bad place to be.
Well, and if you want to stay out of staff feeling like they have to respond to appeals, perhaps it could be a board level, but you should probably quantify it, because I would imagine that if just an open appeals or explanation was available on this framework, right, then everybody would comment on everything. Hey, this isn't fair. This isn't fair. So perhaps quantifying, where appeals fall, or to your point, just allowing the operator to make a public state. So if someone clicks on that, there's a statement from the operator on why that was a abnormality.
Yes, absolutely. To the appeals process, if a charter believes for various reasons, right, that maybe our calculation is incorrect or whatever, then absolutely there is a process for them to come in front of you for that appeal. But if we are talking about just putting a general statement or information, I think that is something that we could work through. It might be something that we might want to have a discussion on, potentially at a later subcommittee meeting. But we could, how I'm envisioning it would be, you have the dashboard, and then off to or at the bottom, you could say statement by the charter operator or something like that. That'd be sufficient.
And we had that under our prior dashboard. I guess just for my clarification, and I'm okay whichever way you want to go, but it's okay if staff continues to use the numbers they use in the calculation, and charter holders who pay off their debt early end up in intervention.
Say it one more time, Andrea.
Typically where, at least for the early payment of debt and the balloon payments, when we've used those large amounts in the calculation, because we're pulling everything from the statement of cash flows, those charter holders are likely going to end up in intervention just because the ratio is going to be skewed immensely, because we paid off $1 million, in debt early. And we obviously didn't generate enough net income to cover that for the year, because we were planning for this for a long time. So just to make sure, and I'm okay either way. I mean, they are the exceptions. They're not everyday kind of events.
I would hope that we're not putting schools or staff through a fire drill because a anomaly puts them into quote unquote intervention. I hope, Andrea, you're spending 5 minutes and going, oh, this is what happened. Okay, done.
Under the current framework, I don't believe there is flexibility built in. And if there is, tell me and I'll make all sorts of adjustments. But I think for transparency purposes, it would be helpful to have that identified in the framework, that if you're in this situation, staff is going to use this amount, or they're going to do this certain thing. Because right now, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't believe that the flexibility is in the framework for me to say, oh, you paid off your debt, I'm not going to consider that full amount or part of that amount as debt principal and include that in the calculation. And again, I'm not sure, but that's kind of also where this is coming from. While they're unique situations, they are situations that have put charters in intervention, whether it was appropriate or not, because the framework didn't give that example.
I would encourage staff to come up with a solution to that problem and redefine what intervention means, redefine the way out of purgatory, whatever. That again, some sort of management level discretion to say that, this intervention, forgive me, I don't know all the steps you go through, but needs to be less intensive than the next one that's on fire on my desk.
Yeah. Maybe some sort of footnotes or something, footnotes in the report. It just seems if somebody's going to pay off debt early, they're doing it for some sort of reason, because okay, that payment is now can be used somewhere. It's just like somebody paying off their house early. We paid off our house and now all of a sudden we're investing all that money in retirements or so, whatever. And it just seems punitive for someone to be planning for something and not being able to, going into intervention and not being, there's no footnotes and it just doesn't fast track them out of this or give the public. I know we're doing this so for transparency, but giving the public just, quick, oh, we paid stuff off early and now we freed up some cash so that ongoing, we're not going to have these, or we refinanced and got, lower payments or longer terms. And we're in a better position. It just seems kind of, there should be some sort of, like I said, like a footnote type of thing that explains that.
Yeah, thank you. I think this partners well with the discussion around cash reserves and creating that thing. Yeah, John, go ahead.
Well, and Madam Chair, exactly that. It is the same. It's the same issue that you have in as it relates to using cash for programmatic investments, they're going to be counted as an expense that are going to make your net income smaller, maybe negative, maybe in the red. Although then it compounds in this case, because now you're also going to be maybe in the red in another measure, right? And closer to intervention when you've done something in the best interest of the school, if you saved up cash and been able to pay off debt. So that one I think there needs to be a solution, like whatever solution comes up for that investment in cash in the school. On the refinancing, whether it be from a balloon payment or just a refinancing of existing debt with perhaps lower interest rate debt, you probably can negate the principal payment with stuff you have in the audits by looking at the new principal less the old principal paid off. Now you don't get credit if the new principal is actually more, it's zero, right? But at least zeroes it out from a current cash flow perspective. And it's stuff that is in the audit, and that'll capture, at least over the last several years, as lots of people have refinanced, that would probably capture most of the situations. There are not a lot of schools that have, utilized cash to pay off debt early. But that one, again, I think can be solved by whatever solution you come up with respect to the cash and net income measures. Expenditure of cash and the impact on net income measures. Thank you.
Agreed. Thank you. So I think not necessarily as an agenda item, but maybe like Jake did for us today, I think it would be very helpful for context to have a short presentation from staff next time on what intervention and probation look like what measures put you in it, what are the steps once you're in it, when do you get out of it. I just think a general overview to kind of frame around our conversation would be helpful. What else would the members appreciate seeing on the next? I feel like we might need more meetings, so I'm just gonna say that I'm willing, if needed, to do more than just the December 1st meeting as the subcommittee to make sure we get this right. Oh, thank you for that. We have to circle back to agenda item D. Oh. I don't know what the appetite of my fellow members are, but I frankly, I'm not sure that this is a change we need to entertain. But if we did want to entertain it, I definitely would want to put it out to the field.
I'll make a motion.
Okay.
This isn't the motion. This is coming.
I'll second that motion.
Member Ruiz,
Aye.
Member Swanson,
Yes.
Member Superintendent Designee Miller,
Yes.
motion passes.
So for future meetings, we want to overview. We have a whole bunch of other items. So much homework for you guys. But we want to take a look at the intervention process itself from an overview perspective. Obviously, the items we discussed specifically. Are there other items, Member Ruiz or Member Swanson, that you want to make sure are included on our next subcommittee agenda?
No, I don't have anything.
This was like an impossibly short timeline, but for the next meeting, I'd love the opportunity to weigh in on the agenda before it's posted, just for flow. And then what were you going to say, Ashley?
Madam Chair, if you're ready to, we do need to ask for if there are any public comment from
great. Yeah.
those in the public.
Do we have any public comment on things to consider for this agenda? Online, do we have anyone who would like to weigh in? Hearing none and seeing none, I think we can move on. Daniel, did you see somebody? No. Item N, do we have any summary information?
Madam Chair, I do not have any additional information other than our next subcommittee meeting is on Friday, December 1st. And we will try to get the agenda materials out to give you more time for a review.
Thank you. And I will ensure that the stakeholders I have access to are encouraged to give comment before, during, so we can have a truly robust conversation where we represent the stakeholders. And for those who couldn't attend the Charter Association conference, there was some wonderful comments on perspective from Ms. Berg, and John did a fantastic job on the financial subcommittee panel. So I appreciate your input today and also your input there. Anything that's been forgotten? Thank you.
Meeting is adjourned.